Good afternoon. Okay, we're ready to go. Good afternoon. I'm calling this meeting of the Willcox AMA Groundwater Users Advisory Council to order. It is 1:01 p.m. on August 20th, Thursday. My name is Ted Haas. I'm the chair, and I would ask that we have, just so everybody knows, we have five members there's five members of this council. Three are live and two, I believe, are online. My name's Ted Haas, and then
I'm Doug Dunlap, farm north of Willcox.
Mark Spencer, just a longtime resident homeowner.
And do we know if our other two members are online yet? Yeah, Ed's out of town, and then Caleb's on.
Yeah.
Do I need to, Caleb? Are you there, Ed?
No, I'm here. Caleb's here.
Okay. Did you have anything to say as part of an introduction, Caleb?
No, just Caleb, work for the city manager, and been in Willcox for about 8 years. So,
And if Ed, thank you. If Ed joins, he'll holler, I'm sure. With that, we do have a quorum. We have at least four of us. At this time, would ADWR staff please introduce yourselves?
Hello, my name is Olga Hart. I'm AMA Director.
My name is Ben Bryce. I'm an advisor to the director of the department.
Hello, David French, AMA Director.
Callie Mari, GUAC Coordinator.
Taylor Pearson, the supervisor of the GUAC Water Management Assistance Program, as well as our IGFR conveyances.
Hi, I'm Brandon Thalman. I am the AMA Establishment Supervisor.
Hi, I'm Alex Babb, and I am also part of the AMA Establishments team. I am the coordinator.
Okay, thank you. I think that's everybody from ADWR. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Callie, for the logistics.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, I would like to go over some meeting logistics. Members of the public who are with us in person today, we ask that you please wait until the call to the public to address the council or ask any questions that you have. Also, for those of you here in person, there is a sign-in sheet located at the little round table right outside this room where you may provide your email to be added to the Willcox AMA mailing list. We ask that council members and members of the public please state their name before speaking aloud. If you're joining us online today, we ask that you please keep your microphone muted during the meeting to reduce audio feedback. If during the meeting you have a question, please feel free to type your question in the chat box and it will be read during the call to the public. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact our help desk. Their contact information can be found on the screen. If you would like to be added to the GUAC mailing list, please email cmari@azwater.gov stating add your email to Willcox AMA GUAC mailing list. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to ADWR's website and YouTube page once the recording is generated. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. And now the main part of this meeting, I'm going to turn it over to Olga Hart, who will do a presentation of the draft proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Council. Thank you, members of the public. If we can go on to the next, or stop right here, actually. So the purpose of today's meeting is for the department to receive the comments of the Council as a body as they appear here in the room and online. We are going to provide, in order to facilitate those comments, we're going to provide an overview of the management plan as a document and a framework. And also, before we do that, go over the process. So what happens now and what's going to happen from now until its formal adoption. Next slide, please. So like I said, before we get into the review or the overview of the document and the management plan itself, we're going to spend a few moments on the timeline and the process. Next slide. All right, so you can see behind me this process. It began on January 8th, 2025 with the creation of the AMA. By statute, we have 2 years for the director and the department to promulgate an initial management plan. So that is what is driving this timeline and those constraints. Next slide. Where are we at today? So on the 3rd, as you all know, we posted the informal draft of the management plan. That's what we're going to be going over today. Just to clarify up front, and I'll repeat this a couple of times because it's important, what you're going to see today, what we're presenting today is a proposal. It's not the final set of requirements. There are many points between today, the informal comment we're finding ourselves in between now and September 3rd, and its formal adoption, as well as the implementation of the conservation requirements for the council, for members of the public, for other stakeholders to provide additional input. Next slide. All right, so I mentioned the informal draft. I want to spend a moment here once again to clarify the difference between the informal draft we're presenting today and the formal draft or the proposed management plan, another way to say the same thing, that will be coming later out in the process. The purpose of today's meeting, like I said, is to receive comments from the council and for us to provide this presentation to help facilitate those comments. Next slide. All right, so once we receive the informal comments, once the comment period closes on September 3rd, once the council offers their comments, the department will spend, we're anticipating spending about a month absorbing those comments, reviewing them, and making any modifications that are needed to that proposed management plan or the formal draft, right? The proposed management plan, once it's completed, starts a very strict statutorily defined timeline. So the rest of the process, once that proposed management plan is in place and exists, is pretty rigid and pretty structured. I'm not going to read this verbatim. We made these slides available online alongside the management plan, and the council also has a copy available, but I will highlight that there are a few steps in the process that are important. The proposed plan will be published. We will notify the council and members of the public and stakeholders of its publication. We will schedule and notify everyone else or everyone of a hearing, of a formal hearing. At the formal hearing, the department is going to present is going to present evidence in support of the management plan. We're going to discuss any modifications we've made between the proposal you see today in the informal draft and the final draft that we propose at the hearing. There'll also be an opportunity for public comments. So this is the informal comment period we're finding ourselves in right now through September 3rd. There will be a formal comment period that will take place prior and at the hearing itself. Following the hearing, the director is going to issue a decision and order, and sometime later there's going to be the promulgation. And like I said, all of these are quite tight and all of these are pretty structured timelines in a process. Next slide. All right. This is our last procedural slide before we start doing our deep dive of the content of the plan. Just want to spend a moment here to highlight once again, the purpose of today's meeting is for the department to receive the comments of the Groundwater Users Advisory Council of the Willcox AMA. This is one of the core responsibilities of the council, and more formally or more specifically, that responsibility is to provide these comments to myself as the AMA director and to Director Tom Bushatsky. At the hearing, at the formal hearing, we are going to, by statute, we are required to summarize the comments you present to us today. So the comments you make are not informally advisory, they are entering part of the formal record associated with the ultimate adoption of the management plan. I also want to emphasize one thing for everyone here. The comments that the council makes today as a body with a quorum are considered the comments of the council. The comments any of these individuals you see here or the two we have online make individually, either before this meeting or after this meeting within that 30-day timeline, are going to be considered individual comments, similarly as any individual comments from any members of the public or the stakeholders. Next slide. All right, so we're going to go right along. We finished the overview. We finished the process, the timeline, the steps, right? What today's meeting is and is not. Now we're going to go through the plan page by page, all 313 of them. Next slide, please. All right, so before we get started, one of the things the department made a concentrated effort, and I'd hope it's visible in the plan, is to talk about in the plan not only the what and the how of the regulation, but also try to expose a lot of the why. And so in that spirit, many of you are probably pretty familiar with the slide by now, but I want to start here because this is the architecture. This is the underpinning of what we're doing today and talking about today. There is one management goal. It's defining the long-term objective for the AMA. It's the North Star. It's time bounded, but it does not include any interim timelines, any interim guidelines. That's where the management plans come in. The goal for the Willcox AMA currently proposed goes through 2075. The first management plan is not intended to cover all of that time. It's intended to cover the first management period. So the management plans establish checkpoints, opportunities to revisit those policies and requirements and continue tracking the AMA along towards the goal. Within the management plan as a document and a framework live the conservation programs. These are where the nuts and bolts, right? The meat and potatoes of those specific requirements are. The conservation programs are where you'll find the specific regulations and the requirements for specific types of users, for specific types of water, along with timelines, flexibility provisions, all of that more granular information. Next slide. All right, so what is a management plan? Well, it's a framework, but obviously, literally, it's also a document, right? And what that document contains is conservation programs, other regulatory requirements. But like I said, these plans contain not just the how and the what we are regulating you to do, but also the why. So there's also explanatory information, there's also narrative, there's also evidence, there's also data in the management plan as well. Next slide. All right, so the management plan, all management plans, this one is no exception, don't live in a vacuum. They are part of a statutory environment. And this is the context for that for the Willcox AMA first management plan. So by statute, we are required to promulgate an initial management plan, which is what we're talking about today, within 2 years of the designation of the AMA. So if you recall that timeline slide we talked about, that is setting that temporal bound. The other part of the statute that imposes certain requirements on us is that the director in developing this plan and subsequent plans is required to include measures for reducing groundwater withdrawals, which follow as closely as practicable the program set forth by the legislature in statute for the initial AMAs. And practicable does a lot of heavy lifting here, right? So it means that we cannot and should not just willy-nilly throw out programs and frameworks from other AMAs, but where the particular context of this AMA doesn't make that practicable anymore, we have both the authority and the kind of imperative to design programs and conservation requirements that are tailored to this AMA. And I say that because we'll talk about that when we go through the plan. You'll see examples of both. You'll see examples of carryover, where we believe the requirements from initial AMAs and other management plans make sense. And then we'll see things that are tailored specifically to the Willcox AMA because your goal is different. Your water supplies are different. The composition of water users is different than other AMAs before you. Next slide. All right, so before we go through the document itself, quick note about the structure. When you've had a chance to look through it, you'll notice it has regulatory chapters. There are 4 of them. Within that are 3 conservation program chapters. There's also that supporting information, right? The whys, a lot of the evidence, a lot of the narrative. Within the regulatory chapters, there's more distinction within them. There's the regulatory language. In the informal draft that you see or that you saw online or may have in front of you, the regulatory language appears under headings that are italicized. The explanatory, the non-regulatory, the non-legal language, the narrative appears, in normal text. And what you're being held to is the legal language. The narrative is just explanatory, it's trying to put in so many words, some of the why, and just help, explain some of that sometimes complicated, sometimes convoluted legalese in in plainer English. And we're going to go through each of these chapters here in a second. Next slide. All right, so we mentioned 3 conservation programs that live within those 4 regulatory chapters. You can see them on the slide. We're going to go through them one by one in a second. I'm not going to spend too much time here other than to, again, just emphasize on the bottom of the slide, you'll see another reminder. The effective date for conservation requirements, whatever those conservation requirements ultimately end up looking like, and today is a proposal, it's the informal draft, will be January 1st, 2029. It's not today, and it's not at the end of the adoption of the management period plan. Next slide. All right, so now we start getting into the document itself. The first section, you can give it as an unnumbered chapter, is the executive summary. Like all executive summaries, it provides context. It sets the stage. It begins with the broadest, the Groundwater Management Act, and how the Groundwater Management Act creates the framework in which the management plans and the conservation programs and the management goal all live. And then it gets more and more granular, right? Next, it talks about the Willcox AMA and provides some background on the rationale, the reasoning behind why this AMA was established, and the significance of that decision. And then finally, it moves to the first management plan of the Willcox AMA itself. So like all executive summaries, it provides the reader with some preview of the structure of the document to come to make it easier to navigate, but it also offers a preview of the water strategy that the department is approaching the development of these regulations with in Willcox. Next slide. The next section, so the next unnumbered chapter, if you will, is a chapter on the proposed management goal. So in here, you'll see a discussion and an overview of the stakeholder informed process the department has taken to date to establish the current proposed management goal that you see on the bottom of the screen in the blue box, right? So statute requires the department within 30 days of the designation or the establishment of the AMA to propose an initial draft goal. But there was iteration. There were several rounds of comments that stakeholders and the public offered, and the department took that in consideration and revised the goal to where we sit today. I'm not going to read the entire sentence, but of course, the key bit is to reduce groundwater overdraft by at least 50% by the year 2075. Next slide. All right. We talked about the department is taking a very intentional approach and not just listing the how and the what in the management plan, but also explaining the why. And so in this chapter, we present the evidence, the information, the rationale for arriving at that proposed goal, that reduction of at least 50% or at least 50% reduction in overdraft by the year 2075. So we recognize the hydrologic realities. We recognize the potential economic impacts. We recognize that there is no purely mathematically optimal option available, right? All options are suboptimal, but one is required because, next slide, the status quo is unacceptable. Safe field, we don't believe is viable, is practicable in this AMA. So because of that, the 50% reduction we feel like is a practicable middle ground between one thing that is impractical and one thing that is impossible to maintain. And we also believe the calendar year 2075 is a practical, reasonable endpoint for the goal or a target for that goal to be achieved because it does 2 things. So for the regulated community, it offers time, right? A 50% reduction in demand management, which is what this AMA is going to have to do because there are not alternative supplies available to just solve the overdraft problem easily like that, is a lot of work. It's going to be difficult and it needs time. For the department, that same time period gives us an opportunity through successive management plans, through successive management periods, to collect better data, to develop better programs, to track the efficacy, right? The impact. What are these regulations that we're proposing today going to do over the next, however many years of this management plan or management period, excuse me? How well are they tracking towards the goal? Are natural water budget components changing over time? Do we need to reevaluate our approach to the conservation programs in the second management period, third, fourth, etc.? So this gives both parties time to do this responsibly, to do this methodically, and to do it adaptively based on the evidence we're going to be increasingly collecting. Next slide. All right. Speaking of evidence, the next chapter in the management plan is chapter 1. This is the hydrology chapter. So in this chapter, the department describes the natural system, the groundwater aquifer that represents the primary source of water in this basin. And we also talk about the stresses, both the natural stresses, the recharge, the outflow, the evapotranspiration, and the human stresses, right? The groundwater pumping, the development, and how they interact with that natural system to produce visible evidence of hydrologic change over time. So in addition to talking about the hydrogeology and the structure of the basin here, and the surface hydrology, the groundwater hydrology, this chapter also presents evidence from field work and from surveys by the USGS and AWR about changes in water level elevations over time, data about land subsidence over time, and data about earth fissuring over time, and demonstrates that those things have been increasing at a growing rate over time. Next slide. So following the hydrology chapter, we move to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the supply and demand chapter. In this chapter, you can read it in more detail in the plan itself. There's extensive discussion about all of the different sectors and subsectors of water use that are contributing to the demand and all of the different components of water supplies. We're not going to go through every one of those things here in minutia. It is in the plan for you all to reference, but there are two key things that we pull out on this slide right here that we're going to mention because we'll come back to them throughout the conservation requirements. The first, you could see on this stark pie chart over here, is that the groundwater represents over 99.5% of the water supply that's being used in the Willcox AMA. This is a to say it's a groundwater dependent basin is probably putting it quite mildly. The other thing that we want to highlight on this slide is that is on the demand side, and that's that the agriculture, based on the average of the last 5 years of estimates we have available, accounts for about 92% of the total water use in present day in the basin. Industrial use is at about 7% and municipal use is at about 0.6%. So a little bit over 1/2%. And here in this chapter, those are the what's and the how's, right? These are just facts here, but we'll come back to them in the conservation chapters because that heavy reliance on groundwater, because those pretty substantial differences between what different water sector or different demand sectors use are going to become the whys that you'll see kind of propagate throughout the rest of the conservation requirements. Next slide. All right, so still in chapter 2, in addition to talking about the supplies and the demands, chapter 2 is also where we present information about overdraft. On the left-hand side, to kind of help you navigate the flow here, we have our currently best available estimate. So by the best available estimates we have, and they are not infallible, we'll talk about that in a second, we're approximating that based on the last 5 years of data, 2020 through 2024, the overdraft rate was estimated to be 154,000 acre-feet per year, which if you think about the goal, that 50% reduction by 2075, we'll put that reduction or that allowable overdraft at 77,000 acre-feet per year. Now, this is an estimate. Before this was an AMA, there was no reporting requirements. There was no monitoring requirements. There's a lot of uncertainty associated with these numbers. We anticipate that uncertainty is going to decrease over time as we get annual reports, but we are not happy with that level of uncertainty. We certainly know the hydrologic evidence makes it abundantly clear that we can't just sit on our hands, right? Something is happening, something has to be done, we're starting now. But we want to be more precise, and we have an opportunity to do that because the department has access to modern geophysics surveying equipment, and we've already begun. So this is the baseline. This is our current best available estimate, 154,000, 77,000 target. But we're going to go a step further. So we're going to be in the Willcox AMA, the department is going to be measuring overdraft directly, empirically, using microgravity measurements. And we've already begun that. So the geophysics survey team completed the first survey in spring of this year. So about half a year or so ago. And they're planning on completing the next survey in spring 2027. And the difference in gravity measurements across a network that spans the entire basin is going to allow them to produce an actual empirical, truth, higher precision, higher accuracy estimate of the actual overdraft rate. And that is what we're proposing to use as the baseline target for what does the goal actually mean when we're measuring progress towards the goal. When we're getting to the second management period and identifying what additional rigor, what additional conservation requirements, water use reductions are needed, it's going to be this gravity determined number and not this estimate based on estimates that we're planning on using. And I'm spending so much time here because this is not just a scientific curiosity, as curious and scientific as it is, but because we're planning on actively incorporating this, not just into monitoring the basin and monitoring the situation, but also evaluating the programs we're implementing in the first management period and designing the next set of conservation programs. This is going to be an objective way to keep the conservation requirements and the AMA tracking towards the management goal over time. Next slide. All right. So chapter 1, chapter 2, executive summary, management goal, all set the stage. Then we get to chapter 3, which is the AMA or the department's water strategy or water philosophy for managing water in the AMA in Willcox. We talked about to the extent practicable, right? And there is a lot of underpinning in the GMA that applies to Willcox as well. We don't throw those out of the window. So part of the department's strategy for managing the Willcox AMA is very similar to the department's strategy for managing AMAs broadly, right? There's going to be the establishment of rights. Many of you in the room are actively participating in that process right now. There's going to be an adoption of assured water supply rules. There is going to be the development of management plans and management goals, right? This very thing that we're talking about today. Those are all required under the GMA, and of course, we are implementing them here as well. But there are also unique things that are unique to our governing philosophy, water strategy, if you will, for the Willcox AMA. The first is making sure that conservation requirements are tracking with economic and hydrologic realities. We talked about the agricultural sector currently contributing to 92% of the water use, industrial use using about 7%, and municipal use lagging at 0.6%. We don't necessarily anticipate that balance will hold forever, but we have currently no evidence to suggest it's going to be radically different. And so in particular, in the first management period, we have a strategy of water use reduction in the sectors that use the most water, efficiency and containment in the sectors that use less, right? So don't make the small sectors that are currently not contributing heavily to the overdraft grow and become a significant problem. Reduce water where a lot of it is already being used, and increase and support and require efficiency everywhere because it's a finite resource. It's all coming from the aquifer. It's non-renewable. And so it's important to do carefully. So that speaks to the regulatory guardrails, second bullet point on the right there, right? So to do that containment, we've added new guardrails that don't exist in other AMAs and don't exist in other management plans to the Willcox first management period to contain non-irrigation use expansion, something that under the GMA does not necessarily exist. But here we're doing it because we feel like it's important not just to protect the state of the aquifer, and people's ability to access water, but also other water users who may, during later management periods, have to bear heavier cuts to their water if the entire AMA is not tracking towards the management goal as well as it should. Next bullet point, we realize it's going to be, this is a basin where the solution is much heavier on demand reduction than supply augmentation. There's no supplies here to substitute. The effluent, the surface water, imported water, right, are all not meaningful enough to offset 154,000 acre feet per year. So we recognize there are going to be cuts in the first management period. In particular, those cuts are going to be in the agricultural sector, and that is not necessarily an easy thing for farmers to metabolize or water right holders to metabolize. And so because of that, the flexibility, I apologize, the agricultural conservation requirements, we structure them flexibly. We assign a specific reduction that has to occur. But unlike in some of the initial management plans and some of the initial AMAs, we're not specifying exactly how you must do it. We're not requiring specific irrigation system upgrades. We are not requiring specific crops to be irrigated. We are trying to provide as much flexibility as possible for implementing that, as long as that reduction takes place. And finally, we mentioned alternative supplies are not going to solve the problem of the AMA as a whole. And it's true at the basin level. However, for certain specific users or certain sectors like the municipal sector, that's not to say that effluent, for example, has no role to play. And so in the municipal sector in particular, and in the industrial to some extent as well, where we create those regulatory incentives for increasing the effluent supply and for putting it to beneficial use. Next slide. All right, so with Chapter 4, we're now firmly in the regulatory chapters. Chapter 4 presents the department's recharge and recovery program. Like we mentioned, we acknowledge and we want to be very transparent that we don't believe that recharge of renewable supplies is going to be the overdraft solution for the AMA. However, every drop helps. And so this program creates that regulatory structure for how can you recharge water, store it for credit, and then recover it. Next slide. And because this is a regulatory chapter, of course, it actually starts getting into very specific requirements, right? Permitting requirements. Where, when, how can you store that water, recover it, receive credits for it? And something I'll highlight for the Willcox AMA, right? It's no surprise to you all, earth fissuring, land subsidence, declining water levels, where you store the water and where you recover it. These requirements for the storage and recovery location criteria are intended to make sure that the problem does not get worse, right? So you're not storing it in one place that has plenty of water and recovering it from an area that's already experiencing, increased impacts for land subsidence or fissuring. Next slide. All right, with Chapter 5, we're still in the regulatory chapters, but now we've entered the conservation programs. Chapter 5 is the agricultural conservation program chapter. Applies to folks with IGFRs, irrigation grandfathered rights. So exempt well owners, none of these conservation requirements apply to them. These are for folks with irrigation grandfathered rights. There are two alternative conservation programs. We'll be going through them in a second here. And there are also some additional, there are also additional conservation requirements for irrigation districts and private water companies. Before we move on, broadly, right, we talked about our strategy for the sector that uses the most water is water use reduction. So in this chapter, in this conservation program, is where you're going to see an explicit reduction. There's going to be a 10% reduction to water duties that we'll be talking and going through here in just a few slides. That's part of that reduce the large users, contain the users that are not large yet but could potentially become problematic, and encourage efficiency everywhere strategy. The conservation program, both of those, both the base and the integrated farm program, operate under the groundwater allotment system. So there are water duties. They're applicable to a certain number of water duty acres. That water results is used to calculate a maximum annual groundwater allotment for the IGFR, and that could be used anywhere on any of the irrigation acres that are grandfathered in. Next slide. All right. So the base program is the default program. In this program, each individual irrigation grandfathered right is treated as an individual grandfathered right. Each IGFR receives a maximum annual groundwater allotment. That allotment, like I mentioned, is calculated based on the water duty acres, the highest number of acres that were irrigated at any point in the qualifying period when you were getting the right, and the water duty. And we'll be going through the water duty here extensively in a second. Under the base program, I mentioned that each irrigation grandfathered right is treated as an individual entity. And so because of that, each one of those entities has to file an individual annual report to the department on their water use. Next slide. All right, so we're going to spend some time on water duties because the water duties are forming kind of the main regulatory, basically, mechanism in this program, or one of the most important ones. So DWR in the Willcox Management Plan calculates irrigation water duties with the same governing equation that we use in all other management areas. And that's the one you see on the top. So the irrigation water duty is calculated by taking the total irrigation requirements per acre for the IGFR and dividing it by that assigned irrigation efficiency. And the top part of that equation, the total irrigation requirements, are a composite. So they're composed, you'll see that one right below, right? They're composed of consumptive use, how much water did the plant need to thrive, to grow, to put on, additional cells, plus other needs. So for some crops, not all crops, there may be some additional water that's required. Maybe you need to pre-soak the seeds in order for them to germinate. It's not water that you're going to see consumptively used out in the field. Nevertheless, in order to actually be able to irrigate that crop, you do need that additional water. So for certain crops, we incorporate it under that other needs box or container. Next comes the leaching allowance. So we recognize that for certain soil conditions, certain crop conditions, there may exist unique situations where some additional water may need to be applied to the soil. It's not necessarily strictly needed for plant growth. It's not an other need. It's a unique, it's in response to a very unique set of circumstances. And so therefore, when we're setting the water duties, we're not calculating a value for that. But in the management plan, you'll see our mechanism or formula for how an IGFR holder can apply for that to supplement their water duty if they can present evidence that their specific soil conditions, their specific crops meet the criteria. And then finally, from the total irrigation requirements, so everything to the left of the minus sign, right? These are all the things that the crops would need. But there's also effective precipitation. So some of those needs potentially could be met by rainfall, right? Perhaps you don't need to irrigate quite as much. And you'll note that it's effective precipitation, not precipitation in general. The distinction between being that precipitation is precipitation, rain, snow, right, that falls down on the soil, but not all of it is actually available for a particular crop. It depends on the timing, it depends on the rate, depends what happens with that water. So to the extent there is any effective precipitation for a specific crop, it would be subtracted out for the total irrigation requirements and not be incorporated into the groundwater allowance allotment. So in the Willcox AMA, in the plan, you'll note two things. The first is that the department reviewed USGS crop surveys data, in particular the latest available year, which was the 2025 survey for the year 2024, and found that over 86% of all of the fields in the basin already operate at an irrigation efficiency of 85% or more. So it makes no sense for us to move backwards in time and encourage the opposite of efficiency. So in the first management plan, we are proposing to set an assigned irrigation efficiency of 85% across all crops, all farm sizes. The other thing I want to note before we move on here is also in the plan, specifically in the appendices to Chapter 5, you'll see our discussion of our analysis of effective precipitation. We reviewed precipitation data across 3 stations, across the basin, going back to the early 1900s. And our analysis determined that the effective precipitation is far too variable for us to feel like we can responsibly incorporate it and subtract it out from the total irrigation requirements. For the vast majority of crops, it's also too low to actually offer any consistent and significant additional input. And so all of those needs have to be met with irrigation. So we're effectively striking effective precipitation in that second formula and treating it as 0. Next slide. All right, so we talked about how the water duty would be calculated. And that sets the water duties as a kind of a framework or regulatory structure, sets a limit. Before the AMA, there was no limit. There was no ceiling to water use. With the water duties, that is that structure that sets the limit. It establishes how much is allowed to be applied on the farm. Well, we talked about reducing water use in the largest water use sector. And that's where this comes in Chapter 5 for the Agricultural Conservation Program. In the first management plan, we're proposing a 10% reduction. We're calling it a standard reduction because we're applying it almost universally across the board, irrespective of irrigation acreage, irrespective of water duty acreage, largely irrespective of crop. And we do that because we find that in our determination, the 10% is that practicable middle ground. We have to start making progress towards reducing water use in the basin, but at the same time, a 10% reduction, what's left after that reduction, is still sufficient to be able to allow us to meet our obligation to provide sufficient water to reasonably continue irrigating the crops that were historically grown during the qualifying period on all of their water duty acres. So by our determination, that 10% reduction for all of the crops, other than the very few, you'll see in the next slide, where we have identified that taking a 10% cut would no longer allow us to meet our obligation to provide reasonable water for those crops to continue being grown on the water duty acres that they're entitled to, is acceptable. So that's the kind of the physical or the tangible, right, rationale. In addition, the department commissioned a third-party study. We partnered with Westwater Research, an independent consulting firm, to do an economic feasibility study. And you can find the report is also online. We summarize it in the management plan, but we also post the full version on the web along the management plan on the Willcox AMA website. And what that study did was develop a half a dozen representative farms. So they were not looking at individual IGFRs, they were not looking at individual operators or individual fields, but they looked across the basin. They determined what are the most, if you're going to abstract this, right? Like how can you reduce this into 6 representative kinds of farms? And they performed an economic study that looked at what happens under the baseline if you were to use, the regular water duties as calculated, and what happens if you impose that 10% reduction? And are those representative farms, can they continue to be economically feasible? And their analysis, like we summarize in Appendix 5D, and Westwater summarizes themselves in their own report from their own words, is that the 10% reduction is economically viable. Next slide. All right, so this table is from Appendix 5B. These are the water duties. We're not going to read them, obviously, line by line. They're available in the management plan. They're available in these slides that were shared ahead of time to make sure you all, had them available at your disposal. So instead of going through them crop by crop, I'm going to call out three things. The crops that have one asterisk next to them: apples, cherries, pears without ground cover, stone fruit without ground cover. Those are those exceptions that I mentioned, where we identified that if we were to impose a 10% reduction to the water duties, there would no longer be sufficient water to reasonably irrigate those crops as they were historically grown during the qualifying period on all of the water duty acres. So these 2 categories of crops do not receive that 10% reduction. All of the other crops do. The other 2 things I want to note. The second one, you are not taking 10%, you are not taking 10%, a 10% cut off of this. This already includes the 10% cut. These are the final proposed water duties. The last thing, these are water duties, so they already include the irrigation efficiency. It's already incorporated. These are not the irrigation requirements, these are the water duties. So that divide by 85%, right, effectively a 15% topper for losses, is already incorporated into these numbers. There's not another 15% that's coming back on top of this. This is it. This is what's going to be used, or is proposed to be, used to calculate that groundwater allotment for each IGFR. Next slide. All right. So we went over the base program, that's the default program. We went over the water duties and how those are calculated and how groundwater allotments work. This is the second, or this is the other or alternative conservation program for agricultural water users that's proposed in the first management plan. and that's the integrated farm program. So both the integrated farm program and the base program, both of these are allotment-based programs. This is not a best management practices program. It operates under the same water duties, water duty acres, groundwater allotment, construct. It's referring to the same water duties you saw just on the slide before. But this one offers IGFR holders that have multiple IGFRs a little bit more flexibility. So subject to some restrictions, you have to be in the same subbasin, irrigation districts. Folks with more than one IGFR could bundle them together into one entity. And that allows that holder of those multiple IGFRs to take their groundwater allotment then and use it across the entire footprint without being prescribed, this IGFR has more water, this IGFR has less. They can now operate it as an integrated farm unit. And also relieves them a little bit of the administrative burden of reporting on each IGFR independently. So under the integrated farm program, you can file one annual report for the entire farm unit. In exchange for that flexibility, the IGFR holder contributes a 5% cut to the aquifer. This is not a permanent cut to their right. It lasts for the duration that those IGFRs are in the program. All of the individual allotments of each of those individual IGFRs that's getting bundled is added together, and 5% is removed. So as long as those IGFRs stay in the program, 5% less water than would otherwise be authorized to be used stays in the aquifer. It's not accruing any credits. Farmers cannot go back and pull that water out later. It's permanently left with the aquifer. Next slide. All right. There are also flexibility provisions throughout the management plan, throughout the conservation programs. In the agricultural chapter, there are flexibility accounts under both the base program and the integrated farm program. In so many words, they recognize that you may be growing exactly the same crop with exactly the same irrigation system, operating exactly the same machinery, but climate, there are weather differences. It's hotter, it's drier. There's blight, what have you. And there are some years where you might legitimately need a little bit more water, and other years where you legitimately may need a little bit less. And these flexibility accounts are like a piggy bank, where during wetter years, colder years, a farmer may store a little bit of water for credit that allows them to dip into that during those drier years when they need more water and still remain in compliance. And this is not unbounded, right? There's a hard limit to how deep in the red you can get. And for the integrated farm program, there is also a limit to how many of those credits you can accrue and keep accumulating. Next slide. All right, and then there are also exemptions in most of these chapters. In the agricultural chapter, the exemption, so we talked about the very top, right, of this particular chapter. None of this applies to exempt well owners, but it does apply to all IGFR holders. However, small exempt rights, so those under 10 acres or 10 irrigation acres or less, are not actually subject to water duties and conservation requirements. So those small rights, the ones that are not playing an oversized role in the overdraft of the basin or any other, any other groundwater withdrawals, are exempt from water duties and conservation requirements. They still need to report. They don't receive an allotment, and they don't have an irrigation water duty associated with them. But there's a catch, right? You can't create a lot of small rights and maintain them together and call that exempt. So that would not count. It would be truly entities that have just that one small 10-acre or less right. Next slide. All right, so with chapter 6, we're moving into the municipal conservation program. Recall again, right? We just left a chapter for a sector that by our estimates is using about 92% of the water in the basin. Chapter 6 is dealing with a sector that's using a little bit over 0.5%, 0.6%. So naturally, some of these requirements, some of the structure is going to look different in the first management plan, because that's what we have, to work with right now. So the municipal conservation program applies to municipal providers. We differentiate between large providers, so those that serve more than 250 acre feet per year, or deliver rather, and small providers that serve less or deliver less than that. There are also individual users. We'll talk about those in a second or in a few slides. Individual users are served by municipal providers rather than self-serve. So they don't necessarily have, they don't have their own withdrawal permits. They don't have their own rights. They are served by a municipal provider. And we'll talk about who those are and what those are. And before we jump in, just another, kind of call back to that water strategy. The strategy here in the municipal sector, in the municipal chapter, a sector that for the purposes of the first management plan and first management period is using a very small amount of total water in the basin, is largely efficiency and containment. Next slide. All right, so there are two, you saw on the previous slide, there are two alternative programs in the municipal sector. I forgot to mention this in the agricultural chapter, the base program and the integrated farm program are optional. There is a default, which is the base, but IGFR holders can toggle between one or the other as they wish. In the municipal chapter, there are certain, or in the municipal conservation program, there are certain kind of hardwired structures that allow a municipal provider to either enter this program or not. And both this program and the next one apply only to the large providers. So this does not apply to those small providers delivering less than 250 acre feet per year. This is for the large providers, 250 acre feet per year or more. And the first of those two programs is the gallon per capita per day GPCD program. This is an efficiency program. So this program looks at the historic use of the large provider and establishes a number. It establishes, you could think of it almost like a water duty, right? But instead of multiplying the gallons per capita per day by an water duty acreage, you're multiplying by the number of people that the provider is serving. And it's intended to drive efficiency and set, again, those reasonable upper bounds, right? Not to let this use grow oversized. Who is eligible for this? In order to participate in this program, a provider has to have a designation of assured water supply. Now, you can choose as a provider to leave this program and move to the non-per capita conservation program that we're going to talk about on the next slide. But in order to participate in this, you must have a designation of assured water supply. Next slide. And this is that other program, the non-per capita conservation program, the NPCCP. This is a best management practices program. So the intent here, the structure here is rather than setting a numeric threshold, gallons per capita per day, right, has a number attached to it. This is trying to achieve similar or better improvements in water use efficiency and conservation through kind of a portfolio or a buffet of different best management practices. And large provider or large municipal providers that are participating in this program have to, hopefully we're good. They're held to two particular standards. So first, the number of service area connections that provider has determines effectively how many best management practices they are required to take on and from how many different categories. And in Chapter 6, you'll also see an appendix that lists what those best management practices are. It's not up to the large municipal provider to come up with their own. There is a specific list that's been curated and approved by the director of ADWR. And among those for the Willcox AMA is a large focus on effluent augmentation and supply diversification. Because again, we recognize this is not going to solve the AMA's problems as a whole, but it's an important component in our strategy for improving efficiency, allowing some potential smart growth in the future for the municipal sector. Next slide. All right, all providers, both large and small, also have to comply with lost and unaccounted for water standards. So these are those, we talked about efficiency, making the best use of the water that has to be pumped. These are those standards. So large providers have to keep their lost and unaccounted for water percentage at no more than 10% of their total deliveries. or sorry, the total water that enters their system. And for small providers, that percentage is 15. To recognize that small providers may have fewer resources, smaller population, therefore more variability. And providers have to be compliant on these targets both annually and on a 3-year rolling average. Next slide. All right, so we talked about large providers, small providers, gallons per capita per day program, non-per capita conservation program. Now we're going to talk about individual user requirements. So before we talk about what those requirements are, we're going to talk about what individual users are. Individual users have a formal definition, and those are people or entities that receive water from a municipal provider for non-irrigation use. And that sounds like, anyone connected to the city opening a tap is an individual user. But that's not quite right, because the full definition is individual users to whom specific conservation requirements apply. And in the Willcox 1MP, the first management plan, we're proposing that these users right here, the bulleted list, those are those categories of users to whom these conservation programs requirements apply. And that's turf-related facilities, publicly owned rights-of-ways, large-scale cooling facilities, new large industrial users, and data centers. And municipal providers provide water to these individual users, these categories, entities that fall in these categories, and both individual users and the municipal provider share the responsibility for compliance. And in a few slides, we'll talk about how that responsibility can shift. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about what are those individual user requirements. What are those individual users or the municipal providers that are serving them required to do on behalf of the individual users? So we're not necessarily going to go through line by line for each one of these slides, but the important thing, the high level thing is individual users are being held. These are types of industrial facilities. You're going to see corresponding categories for them in the industrial chapter. These all correspond to different subsectors in the industrial chapter. And what these requirements are saying effectively is just because you're an industrial user that's being served by a municipal provider should not exempt you from the same conservation requirements that you would be subject to if you had your own right and were officially called an industrial user. So all of these requirements are callbacks to Chapter 7, the Industrial Conservation Program, and effectively tell you you have to meet the same requirements. Now, there's an interesting distinction. If you're an industrial user that is operating solo, right, self-serving, you have your own right, a type 1 or a type 2, or you have a withdrawal permit, you've already secured that permit or you've already secured that right. If you have a right, your water use is already accounted for in kind of the broader structure, the accounting for existing grandfathered water use in the basin. But if you're an individual user, you're served by a municipal provider, and technically there's not that same containment. So in the Willcox First Management Plan, we're proposing something new, which is that new individual users, or I apologize, new industrial users that are individual users, new industrial users that are coming over 100 acre feet, that need over 100 acre feet per year of water, that are coming to a municipal provider and asking to be served by that provider, have to do two things. So they have to comply with all of the same requirements in the industrial chapter, but they also have to mitigate overdraft by offsetting their use one-to-one elsewhere. So they don't have their own right. They're relying on the city. They're relying on a municipal provider. In order to be served under these regulations, they have to go elsewhere in the basin and make sure that a comparable amount of water does not get extracted from the aquifer effectively. Next slide. All right, and we talked about, we're going to briefly mention who is responsible for compliance with these regulations, right? Who is responsible in this, where we just left the conversation, for example, for that offset in use, for that mitigation. Well, the default is that the municipal provider is responsible. But if the municipal provider does not wish to personally be held responsible for meeting those requirements, they can notify the department we will notice the individual user, and after a year has passed, that responsibility for compliance passes from the municipal provider to the individual user themselves. So that entity, that facility is now responsible for meeting all of those individual requirements that we talked about on the previous slide. This does not mean they're not getting served water. We're not turning off the taps, right? They continue being a customer of the utility of the municipal provider, but now the responsibility is on them individually to meet those requirements. Next slide. All right, so with that, we close the municipal chapter. We move on to chapter 7, which is the industrial chapter. The industrial conservation program is the third in the conservation program. So just, for those of you getting a little exhausted by this, we are tracking towards the end of the plan. The industrial chapter, industrial conservation programs, these apply, like we just talked about when we're talking about those individual users, specifically to people or entities with type 1 or type 2 non-irrigation rights or groundwater withdrawal permits. So those that are self-served, not served by a municipal provider, for example. The industrial program recognizes that industrial water use is a very broad umbrella. There are a lot of very different kinds of industrial facilities that use very different amounts of water in very different kinds of ways, and that the technologies or the water use reductions or the best management practices or the efficiency standards that you could reasonably impose on those really different kinds of facilities or infrastructures are very different. So this program has overarching requirements for all industrial users. All industrial users have certain reporting and monitoring requirements about their water use. All industrial users have to submit a conservation plan that gets approved by the department. But then, next slide. But then in addition to those umbrella requirements that all industrial users have to comply with, they also, where they fall into one of these dozen or so categories, have these additional requirements that stack on top. And in these subsector requirements is where we have those specific requirements for turf-related facilities, for feedlot operations, for data centers. The other thing I'll note on this slide, you'll see three subsector programs: turf-related facilities, dairy operations, and feedlot operations, with a little asterisk or a little star next to them. That's because those three specific subsectors have allotments. So when we talked about the agricultural program, or the agricultural conservation program, we talked about water duties that set a maximum annual groundwater allotment. For these three subsectors, something similar comes into play. They also have a maximum annual groundwater allotment. But unlike for IGFRs, these facilities have rights, and the volume of their type 2, what they are eligible by the right to withdraw, for example, may be higher or may be lower than the allotment. The allotments are conservation measures, but the right limits how much they are legally allowed to withdraw and use. So for these specific sectors, there is an allotment, but individuals or entities, right, that fall under these and have an allotment are required to use the lesser of a two. So if your allotment calculates as higher than your right, you are not allowed to use that additional water. The right limits you. The volume of the right limits you. And conversely, just because you have a right for a greater volume, if the allotment actually puts you under that ceiling, you have to abide by the allotment. So it's the lesser of the two is what you have to comply with. Next slide. All right, so there are about a dozen different subsectors. We're going to go through them one by one, starting with turf-related facilities. So at the top of the slide, to help you navigate, we try to draw out not all turf facilities, right? There are limits. There are basically small facilities under a certain threshold that, just like those small exempt rights, for example, that we talked about in the agricultural program, are not meaningfully contributing as much. These would still have to comply with the requirements for the general industrial conservation program, but not for the subsector requirements. But for turf facilities that have 10 or more acres, are required to comply with these subsector requirements. And the turf-related program, the turf subsector program, is largely like we mentioned, an allotment program. So there is an allotment that's calculated. The user, the turf facility has to comply with either the volume of the right, or the volume of the allotment, whichever is lesser. There is flexibility to account for, sometimes things happen, vegetation dies, you may need to drain and refill a water body. So there are very sector specific types of provisions for that flexibility to allow intermittent, reasonable additional water that goes beyond the allotment, but does not do that, in perpetuity or as a default. And you'll notice at the very bottom of the slide, effluent, right? So we'll keep harping on this. Effluent can't solve the problems of the AMA as a whole, but in every instance where utilizing it can put additional water to beneficial use and help offset the use of groundwater, there are regulatory incentives to doing that, and turf facilities include some of those incentives. Next slide. All right, the next subsector is sand and gravel operations. Sand and gravel operations, again, right, you have to meet certain threshold criteria to be responsible for meeting these conservation requirements as a sand and gravel operation. This is a best management practices type program. So there are certain industry best standards, certain best management practices that are required. Some are prescribed and some are, pick your own adventure style. So sand and gravel facilities that fall under the eligibility or applicability criteria here also have to submit a conservation plan. So they're being asked not just to comply with certain best management practices already, but also to look ahead and think about where additional reduction in water use, increase in efficiency could reasonably occur, and where they can use alternatives like effluent to help offset and drive down their groundwater use. Next slide. Next up are large-scale power plants, defined as power plants that are either designed and or are operating at over 25 megawatts of electricity. And within that, we also further specify or distinguish between 3 different kinds of power plants. These requirements are also more best management practice type requirements. And here too, there are flexibility provisions that acknowledge, that there are operational health and safety considerations, environmental considerations, other regulations outside of AWR that power plants may need to abide by. And so there's flexibility, there is structured flexibility to account for that where it's needed. This program also requires or encourages beneficial reuse of wastewater and reduced waste, right, by requiring or encouraging, zero liquid discharge. Next slide. All right. The next subsector is large-scale cooling facilities. The kind of the core requirements here are also best management practices, specifically with a cycles of concentration target. So to encourage more reuse of the water, requiring less new groundwater to be pumped and entered into circulation. And once again, you'll notice the incentive for effluent. Next slide. All right, dairy operations. Dairy operations are the second of those three allotment-based programs. Dairy operations that are subject to these regulations are ones that annually house a monthly average of 100 or more lactating cows per day. This is an allotment program. The allotment is based on the number and type of cows in the dairy. Like we talked about, the right is that ceiling, so you cannot just add additional dairy cows and up that allotment over the right, the volume of the right. There are flexibility programs here too, acknowledging that just like farmers may need to use some more water in some years and less in others, some of those same weather fluctuations may also require animals to need a little bit more water some years, a little bit less in others. So there's that 3-year rolling average provision that helps determine whether these facilities are in compliance with the requirements or whether we can begin taking enforcement action. Next slide. All right, feedlots, similar in concept, similar in construct. The feedlots that are held or that are eligible, the feedlots for which these requirements are applicable are those that house and feed over an average of 100 or more beef cattle per day. Similar construct, there's an allotment based on the number of animals. There are also additional top-ups for that allotment based on the other kind of natural de facto operations of the dairy. Same situation. Your allotment cannot exceed your right. It's the lesser of the two. And similar provisions, recognizing that anytime you're watering and housing animals, you may need a little bit more water when you're a little bit less the other. And so we look at compliance as a 3-year rolling average rather than hitting every single year exactly on the mark. Next slide. All right, metal mining. There are multiple programs and alternative programs for metal mines that process 500 acre, or I apologize, that use more than 500 acre feet per year to process and mine ore. There are baseline requirements, and we distinguish within the baseline requirements between mines that are already existing. And so a lot of their design decisions, right, are somewhat locked in, and new mines that don't exist yet. They may have a little bit more flexibility, right, early in the process to introduce methods and designs that can help drive that additional conservation and efficiency. And there's an alternative mining conservation program. Next slide. And both of these programs, both the requirements for pre-2029 mines, post-2028 mines, as well as the alternative mining conservation program, largely best management practice type programs. This is not an allotment program. The right effectively acts as that maximum ceiling in that allotment. But instead here, there are industry best practices, best management practices that these mines are required to abide by, and a conservation report that they have to produce and file with the department. Next slide. All right. So now moving into new large landscape users. So these are large landscape users that don't exist yet. These are users that would be coming in or looking to come in after January 1st, 2029, right, when the conservation requirements kick in. And effectively, we distinguish between hotels and motels and all other kinds of users. But effectively, the gist of the idea here is we don't want to encourage indiscriminate expansion of water-intensive landscaping in the future. And so there are requirements and there are restrictions. And once again, you'll note at the bottom, right, incentives for using effluent where possible. Next slide. All right, now new large industrial users more broadly. So similar timeline, these are not users that exist yet. These are not facilities that exist yet. These would be ones that would be coming in after January 1st of 2029. They are subject to all of the same requirement, the top level requirements for all industrial users. So conservation report, monitoring and reporting to the department. And their conservation plans have to demonstrate not just what they're going to be doing now, but in 10-year increments, roughly kind of corresponding to the duration of a management period, all the way through 2075. And explain what are those practices that they're planning on implementing through the end of the goal to track and to, also participate in the AMA's reduction of water use over time. Next slide. And finally, the last subsector in the industrial conservation program are data centers. So this is not written necessarily, right? There's not a January 1st, 2029 timeline there, right? But we appreciate that this may be more forward-looking than, for existing facilities. So this applies broadly to data centers. You'll notice that data centers are quite broadly defined. There are two conservation requirements associated with data centers. There's an efficiency requirement. So we specify the data centers have to stay under a 12-month averaged annual water use effectiveness of 0.15 liters per kilowatt hour. So what is that, right? The water use effectiveness, it's an industry standard metric. It's a best practice. It's defined in international standards. It looks at the total water use that's used on site by the data center in liters and divides it by the amount of electricity that the IT equipment takes to run in kilowatt hours. And 0.15 is that threshold that we're proposing in the first management plan for Willcox. The other requirement is the conservation plan. Once again, this one too goes out through 2075 and 10-year increments and requires data centers to identify the areas of their operations that have the largest potential and actual water use, specific mitigation strategies that they plan on enacting and when they're planning on enacting those. Next slide. All right, the industrial program, we're almost to the end of this chapter, also contains exemptions. So just as we had small exempt rights for the agricultural program, we have effectively small exempt rights in the industrial chapter as well. And for the industrial program, those are type 1s or type 2s, or entities or folks with groundwater permits that are less than 10 acre-feet per year. 10 acre-feet per year or less. And similarly to the agricultural program, you cannot stack multiples of these, right? It's one entity actually using less, 10 acre-feet per year or less, and owning actually just 10 acre-feet per year or less of cumulative permits or volumes or rights. Next slide. Actually, I apologize, go back one slide. I jumped over what the actual exemption is, and they are exempt not from the volume of the right, not from anything else, but just the monitoring and reporting requirements. So those small irrigate or non-irrigation rights and withdrawal permits do not have to meet the same monitoring and reporting requirements that those larger industrial users do. Next slide. All right. So we talked about rights. The other way that industrial users could be self-served is through general industrial use permits. So rights are grandfathered in, type 2 rights are actively getting processed through the grandfathering and process. Type 1 rights can be converted from irrigation to becoming type 1, but all of these nevertheless are tracking water that has historically already been used in the AMA in one way or another. Permits could introduce additional brand new water demand into the AMA. And so we talked about containment, and we talked about the Willcox management plan doing something a little bit different than the Groundwater Management Act allows more broadly, and that's happened in previous AMAs. There is already precedent, there's already structure, there's already authority to contain irrigation use from expanding. But the same cannot necessarily be said about industrial use. These permits are one way that currently non-irrigation use could expand beyond the container that the rights put on them. And that's what we're trying to close in the first management plan with these permits. So general industrial use permits can be issued by statute when the permit applicant can demonstrate that they cannot reasonably get water in any other way. A municipal provider cannot serve them. They cannot reasonably obtain type 1 or type 2 rights. And so they can provide an application to the department and apply for this permit to give them the right to withdraw groundwater. But the same statute that creates these permits also provides the department with the responsibility and the authority to evaluate the permits against whether or not issuing them in the volume requested would be consistent with the management plan and the management goal. And so using that, next slide. In the first management plan for Willcox, we are proposing these requirements that we believe would make any issuance of these permits actually do that thing, right, that we're supposed to be doing. So making any permits consistent with the management goal, consistent with the management plan. And that is, first of all, to constrain the duration of these permits. These permits were never intended as replacements for permanent rights. They were always intended to be temporary water use, limited volumes of it. And here we're explicitly defining that duration. So we're putting a hard cap on 10 years. We're proposing that these permits can be issued in intervals no longer than 10 years. We're also, in light of the management goal, in light of the fact that the management goal can only be met if there is consistent, persistent, and increasing reduction in groundwater use in the basin, and there are no alternative supplies here that can meaningfully help with that. The second bullet point, we're also proposing an offset requirement. In order to obtain one of these permits, if you want one of those longer term permits that nevertheless still, cannot get them for more than 10 years, you have to demonstrate that a 1-to-1, if you're asking for 1,000 acre feet per year of water, 1,000 acre feet per year of water elsewhere in the basin during the time periods you have this permit and you're using it is not being used, to not increase and, unrestrict water use in the basin. You'll note that we're calling out IGFRs in particular, right? We're talking about offsetting this industrial use with irrigation grandfathered rights. And I just want to highlight that we're not picking on irrigation, we're not picking on agriculture. If you recall on the previous slide, the conditions that would lead someone and let someone apply for this permit is that they've demonstrated that they cannot get service from a municipal provider, they cannot obtain their own type 1 or type 2 right. So really the only thing that's left are irrigation grandfathered rights, right? So that's why it's focusing on those in particular as the offset mechanism. And there are certain criteria, you'll see them in a management plan, you'll see them on the slides as well, about how we can enforce and identify that that offset is really happening. But we also recognize, right, that every one of these regulations needs some pressure release valve, needs some flexibility provisions. And there may indeed be places and cases where you truly need a very small amount of water for a very short amount of time. And that is where this second to last bullet point comes in. So short-term permits for de minimis water users do not require an offset, or that is our proposal, right? So what does short-term mean? 2 years or less. So perhaps truly a short amount of time, you need just a little bit of water. This is that mechanism. What is de minimis? What does minimal mean? Well, we are proposing here that it's treated not just as an individual permit, one at a time, but that the total volume of all of these unoffset de minimis permits at any one time cannot exceed 1% of the department's latest estimate of the overdraft in the basin. So whether that's a few slightly larger permits or many smaller ones, we're attracting collectively to that 1%. And as long as the permits, meet all of the requirements, they would be issued. Otherwise, their options are the offset mechanism. Next slide. All right, so that brings us to the last chapter in the plan, chapter 8. So chapter 8 talks about implementation, enforcement, and compliance. So this chapter covers the how the department is going to be implementing the management plan and its provisions, some of the rules and regulations we have to abide by, as well as the rules and regulations that others have to abide by, and what is our enforcement authority, where does it come from, and how do we plan on exercising it. In chapter 8 of note also is a discussion of variances and administrative reviews. Variances can be applied for. So these are both kind of formal structured mechanisms. Variances for where an individual specific users may need some additional time to come into compliance with requirements. They can request a variance. It's a formal process. There's certain evidence that needs to be provided, and the department can evaluate them. Administrative reviews are cases where a specific user may identify that the conservation requirements that were written for a broad sector or a broad type of facilities, for example, they have evidence and concrete reason why they are unable to comply with them, why they cannot, make them work. And they can, again, with evidence and a formal process, request an administrative review and identify whether the department can legitimately issue some modifications or exemptions for them. And like I mentioned, this chapter also covers our compliance and enforcement strategy as well. Next slide. All right, thank you for your patience, everyone. We are at the last slide. Just a quick reminder before I pass this back to our chair. We are currently in the informal comment submission period. The comment period is running through September 3rd. We'll take comments any way the public has them, but we prefer them in writing. We prefer them with evidence and justification to the extent possible. The purpose of today's meeting, though, is for the department to receive comments from the council and take any questions as well that the council may have.
Thank you, Olga. That was a marathon. You did a good job. Do I have Ed and Caleb online? So I'm speaking to the council here. It's our opportunity, if I understand, and I think I do, it's our opportunity to ask any questions that are obvious to us. I have a question to ADWR. Can this council submit a letter to get, from the council? But that would require a subsequent meeting, and that would require the open meeting laws. So probably I should say we should speak now. Yeah. And I had a couple things on my mind, but I'd like to ask Mark and Doug if you had any specific questions or comments. And then we'll get to, if it's okay with you guys, we'll do the in-person first, and then we'll ask the virtual attendees. I'm going to pass this to Mark, and then we'll go from there.
You see my 2 pages of questions. No, just something really fundamental first, because I'm not a farmer, I'm an engineer. IGFRs, are they established by the actual estimate of water usage over the last 5 years, or is it based on the crops and the amounts that you showed on the slides that those crops would require?
The latter.
Thank you. And help me to understand this. An IGFR, I see the equation in my head, is equal to acre foot divided by efficiency. That would end up with an answer that is greater than the actual amount in the numerator. Is that correct? So if you take a 100 acre feet divided by 0.85 efficiency, you come up with 120 acre feet.
That's right. So the irrigation efficiency assumes that you'll need additional water, because not, as an engineer, you'll appreciate this, right? Like, you're going to have losses along the way.
Okay.
But I do want to clarify that the water duties, the table that we shared, that's the final number. So it already includes that efficiency division.
Correct. Yes, I understood that. Okay. IGFR credits. So again, not being a farmer, so a farmer has I know it's a lot more than this. Let's call it 100 acre feet. Only uses 80 acre feet. He's got a 20 acre foot credit, he or she. That credit can be moved elsewhere, anywhere in the basin. Is that correct?
I think you're talking about the flex accounts.
Yes.
So the flex accounts, there are provisions for buying and selling those flex accounts, but they have strict limitations on the time when those flex accounts could be sold. So the answer is yes, with restrictions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, IGFR is based on 5% use. Okay, got that one. On page 76 of the plan, and you've mentioned it several times in many places, where for a new industrial user of more than 100 acre feet, they would be required, either the municipality who supplies them, or in the rare case, or I guess who knows what's rare, but a case where they could prove that they couldn't get this from anywhere else, they would be required to show an offset elsewhere out of existing IGFRs. Could those be the credits that are bought and sold as well out of the?
The plan doesn't specify that.
Okay.
So we can take that as a comment rather than a question.
Okay. Yes. Okay. And relating to that, because, agriculture is the big thing on the table, and you'd think you'd want the most flexibility there. And I'm only speaking because, I interact with a lot of the community. And one of the biggest concerns is of our vintners here. And of course, they can't grow their crops in the center of the valley, everybody knows, because of frost and such. They got to be on the slopes and this and that. And of course, the EMA has locked the number of acres down. But the plan has a provision for increasing industrial use by offsetting. Could it also introduce a way of expanding acres by offsetting IGFRs elsewhere in the valley, so that and this just makes sense long-term to me because it's probably going to come up other crops that are lower water use that may be required elsewhere to be grown elsewhere, not under currently irrigated acres. Is there a way, or do we need legislative action to allow such?
That is a delightfully provocative, could be a term, idea. The GIUs, the general industrial use permits, are expressly provided for in statute, right? They are not a product of our ideas. The statute says thou shalt do this, DWR, and we're doing it, right? So that is why there is that ability for expanded industrial use. What we have tried to do is make sure that if there are farmers here who are going to see reductions in their water duties, that we're not going to see expansions in the GIUs, right? And so those GIUs have to go out to those farmers, willing buyers, willing sellers, right? They're not pulling away from farmers without their input. But that's why that provision exists. To your question, without a legislative change, the statute does not allow for us to allow an expansion of irrigated acres.
Okay, so we have some marching orders.
Not from DWR.
Nope, not from you, but for the vintners who are listening. The last question I have is page 95, the standard, very well described, the standard reduction of 10%. I understand that that's, based on the allocated per crop, but there are farms and farmers that are already growing very water efficient crops. Are they hit with the same 10%?
Thanks. So all of the crops other than those two that we identified, right? The stone fruit and I'm blanking on the other one. Thank you. Yes, all of those are hit with that same 10% reduction. If you look through the appendix we put together in chapter 5, I believe it's 5B, we went pretty thoroughly crop by crop to evaluate based on the best available data we have available. Where would our proposed water duties and consumptive uses put them? And are we providing enough water to continue irrigating that? And that's what we used to determine the ones that did not have that 10% buffer to cut and still reasonably be able to irrigate. I also want to clarify something, right? We have successive management plans and successive management periods. What you're seeing here is a proposal specifically for this first management plan. You'll see that, you saw the 10% reduction. It's not a 50% reduction. That's right. So what's to come may or may not, we're not hardwiring specific decisions that are going to apply all the way to that 50% reduction in overdraft through 2075.
Okay. And this is another basic farming question, which you might not be the right folks to ask. I got farmers on both sides of me here and on the phone. But I'm thinking of a nut tree orchard, that maybe have planted 2 or 3 years ago. It's using a certain amount of water. How is the IGFR calculated for that? Because those trees, I would expect, would be using multiple times the acre feet as a sapling as they will when they're a mature nut tree.
So for the permanent crops for the trees, we based that on estimates for mature crops, right? Understanding that you may plant early, but in order to continue irrigating it, it has to actually come to maturity.
And last question, and this is a biggie. Yes, I know, and maybe this could be something we have to do with legislative, I'm sure, but it seems to me that, the ultimate goal, which isn't of this basin, but if we could reach equilibrium, boy, everybody, that'd be the unicorn, which we can't. But if you can look at a crop and say, okay, it's only using up to the natural recharge of the aquifer, that would be, if you could somehow base reductions down to and then stop at that level. So someone who is using the current recharge or less for a crop, they don't need to get any more efficient because they're not, that individual crop is not exceeding the natural recharge. Does that make sense? Is there any kind of consideration like that in the plan?
That makes sense. It's a very interesting comment. Let me it's a good question. Let me formulate my thoughts for a second. The recharge that we are looking at when we're summing up the total inflows to the basin, right? In the hydrology chapter, I think it talks about, and if not, previous DWR reports talk about that we reference that most of the recharge doesn't happen on the valley floor. So you can't look at a specific IGFR and establish that on this particular bit of land identified legally as the IGFR, there's this set rate of recharge, and therefore this set, piece of land could be using this much water and be in equilibrium. It's kind of across the basin.
Right, understood. And the goal is based on across the basin as well. So why not, if, the average, we know what the average inflow is for the basin, whether it's mountain front or elsewhere. I'm saying on a more general like that.
Right. Okay, sure. Well, actually, so if whoever's manning the slides, if you could go to the second of the management goal slides, to your question, if I recall correctly, we're pulling out some of those. One more back, please. Thank you. So we pull out some of those numbers and statistics or estimates rather, that we're referencing in the chapter, right? Which is when, by USGS estimates, by AWR estimates, the last time the basin was in equilibrium was late 1940s, early 1950s. And the department, based on groundwater modeling, completed some years ago, but not that long ago, estimates there are about in the 40,000s, give or take, acre feet per year of annual recharge. Well, back then, when the basin was roughly in equilibrium, right, by the best available estimates, and of course, none of those estimates are perfect, right, there were about 10,000 acres in agricultural production. And right now, and by right now, I mean 2024, right, when the USGS did their last crop survey, it's at 75,000, right? So I'm not necessarily going to answer that question, right, yes or no, but just to put that into context. And we are required to provide sufficient water to irrigate all the water duty acres, right? So you could see how that might be exceedingly difficult.
I think we lost you.
Check, 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 check.
It is. Now it is. Okay.
So we were on that reporting requirement. We get through that? I just wondering when it started, or when do we gotta start reporting to the state?
That's right. So testing. Let's try again. Testing. Okay, we'll have two answers. So the annual reporting requirements started when the AMA was established. But the annual reporting requirements for Willcox were March 31st, 2026. And those predated, those predated the GFR application deadline. So even though the reporting requirements began this year, but we intentionally did not enforce them. We put out a short, statement on our website saying we're not going to require reporting this year because the application deadline hasn't passed. The department has no way to determine yet, who needs to be submitting. You have no way, we have no way to track your applications when they came in. So essentially we gave a hall pass for this year. Now, those initial reporting requirements are very bare bones. It's just the volume of water pumped from, all of the wells or the one well you have that you pump them from, and whether that water was used for an irrigation use or non-irrigation use. The management plan and the conservation program has additional reporting requirements, right? Industrial facilities may need to break down their water use into so many different categories, right? Report on how they're meeting those cycles of concentration, etc. All of those more specific, detailed requirements, aside from I pump this much water from these specific wells for irrigation or non-irrigation use, all of those things don't become effective until January 1st, 2029. So right now we're in the bare bones period. No one did anything bad. The withdrawal authorities that did exist in the Willcox AMA before the application deadline got noticed. They were required to submit annual reports, but everyone else was not required to because you really had no great way to provide them, and we had no great way to ingest them and be able to say with confidence, 50% of the basin reported or 75% of the basin reported. And so therefore we felt like those numbers wouldn't, really offer us a whole lot to go off of.
Will they send us a form or?
Yes, thank you. So by January of the year, for the applicable reporting period, we are going to notify non-exempt water users that have to report. So you don't have to guess. You will receive a formal notification from the department saying, get ready by March 31st. You're required to submit an annual report. Here's how you do it. Here's the form. Here's what happens if you don't.
Next question. On up there, I seen a deal that showed a 15-year on this first plan.
Are you talking about the management goal?
Something said something about 15 years. Instead of 10. That start when the AMA started and 5 years, or how's this work?
So we are not planning for the first management period to be 15 years long.
What you were looking at is the initial management goal that the department proposed, one that we are not proceeding with, had initially said 15 years. And so in the interest of, full disclosure, we put it up there to say, hey, you'll remember this. We're not doing that one anymore. That's where the 15 years comes from. And we had some intrepid reporters who saw that and may have reported it in a Tucson-based newspaper. So that is out there. We are not planning for a 15-year management period. We are planning for 10.
Doug, you were at the start 10. Is that
2029.
So the way that this all works, this first one is a little different because everyone has to apply for things. The management plan is coming into effect for the first time. Unlike subsequent ones, there's not an existing one to rely on. So in 2029, we're going to start running the clock.
Okay, I think, let me check here. So we still don't have the ability for the other two council members to do anything online? Okay,
I click on the new link and it tells me that the host is no longer active.
okay, so I have Caleb on the line. I'm gonna try to feed him through this mic. He had some questions. Go ahead, Caleb, you have the floor.
Hi, guys. I apologize. It would have just been easier if I was in place, but I'm gone with my mayor and council members right now. So I had just a couple of questions. My first question would be, anyone over 100 acre feet requires industrial, I have the terminology written down right here. Let me just see. Anything over 100 acre feet is a new industrial user. So would an apartment complex, and I think, did it say an apartment complex and a mobile home park that required over 100 acre feet would be considered an industrial user?
Stand by.
The answer to that is no. So an industrial user has to be defined as one of those, subsectors that are in an industrial chapter, and those would be considered residential. The apartment complex and the RV mobile home park.
Did you hear that?
No, I just.
So the industrial use are defined, but they're different. What you said would be residential, like an apartment or a mobile home park.
Okay, so like the data centers and those other things are industrial.
That's the industrial.
Yeah, I was just researching which user groups use over 100, sometimes can use over 100 acre feet of water. And they brought up mobile home parks and apartments and some other groups. And I just had concerns about that right away, because trying to get low income housing, if they had to come in and do a 1-to-1 ratio and go pursue water rights from farmers or other groups, that could get very expensive, and then they wouldn't be low income housing anymore. So just looking at that from that point of view. The drought tolerant plant list, I think, is great. That's something we're actually working towards as a city already. So we'll go through there and see what things align in there. We're trying to develop a new palette for our community and our city residents as new businesses come in to do that. And then the only other thing I had was like the golf course is a turf related facility. So even though it's connected to our city water system right now, we would have to go and get a separate permit for that. Correct?
No.
No,
No, we wouldn't.
you would not. Yep, you're okay.
Okay. Just any new golf courses.
And I think so. They're talking about it.
We don't have plans to build new golf courses. We can barely maintain the one we have, but.
Yeah, no, I don't know. There, three of them are talking, and they could answer every question up to that one. So you stumped but but
That's my goal, is to stump them. So
no, I think the current one is fine, and the new one, let's let them mull over that, Caleb. Was there any other,
the only other question I asked was can water from the IGFR, does it have to be, so let's say that there was a farmer that owned a pivot, and then a half mile down he owned another pivot, but they wanted to consolidate it. He wanted to consolidate his pivots, and then he wanted to sell the water hypothetically to a data center down the road, right? Does his IGFR have to be continuous, where the properties have to border each other? And then if he was to pass on his water, with that reduction, I think it said it was a 5% cut for industrial that had to be passed, 5 or 10% cut. Does that then, whatever thing, if it was a data center, would that have to be right next to the IGFR properties, or could it be located 2 miles down the road?
I want him to be able to hear you too, Olson.
Okay. Let's try all these multiple microphones at once. So in order to be in the integrated farm program, the IGFRs would have to be contiguous. But Caleb, to the question about how would a data center purchase that if they needed the offset? They don't have to purchase one single contiguous IGFR. They can assemble that water portfolio to meet the offset requirement by purchasing multiple non-adjacent IGFRs of different volumes throughout the basin. So the 5% cut applies to IGFRs that enter the integrated farm program. So if the farmer is not bringing the IGFRs into the integrated farm program, there is not a cut. And that cut, yeah, that's where it stops. I don't fully follow the question.
So
So you can split IGFRs. That's a mechanism. So 100 acre feet of new use and 100 acre feet avoided of existing use. You want to tell?
Caleb, if
But for some of those types of users, I do think we should consider saying like, I think it would be looked at as a positive in the community because you could reduce water use faster and reach that 50-year goal sooner. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes, I think we understand you.
Understood. And we'll take that as a comment.
And that's, they're taking that as a comment.
And
Oh, I apologize. Ted, would you like to paraphrase Caleb?
Yeah, so the Caleb said as a comment, if in the future, if an IGFR is transferred from an agricultural producer to another industrial use, perhaps it would be beneficial to have a dockage or a 10%. He didn't give a number, but so if X gets transferred, maybe X minus 5% would be able to be transferred in an effort to try to help reach our long-term goal. Does that make, okay. Anything else on your end, Caleb? I got another phone over here with Ed on it. I'm gonna put you two together and you can wear the batteries down.
no, I'm good. I'll let Ed give his comments now, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, all right. And I'm gonna put this on like that here. Sure. Ed, you're with Mark.
Oh, we're in trouble now.
Should be and vice versa. And I stepped out of the meeting room where I'm at, and it's raining straight down outside. So
Prescott's getting rain.
Yeah, Prescott's getting rain. But so to this, first off, if it's a type 1, they're only going to be able to use 2 acre feet. Is that correct, per acre? In other words, once it's transferred to type 1, there, I believe the way that reads is there's only, in other words, no matter what, let's say it was 100 acres and they had 5 acre feet. But for type 1, once it transfers, you can only transfer 2 acre feet per the 100 acres. So it would be 200 acre feet would be the max. Is that correct?
I think
Ben is answering.
I think what we're watching happen is we're being a little imprecise in our terms and we've all lost the plot. So let me try and back up a little bit.
Gonna back up a little bit.
In the statute, there's this concept of general industrial use permits. And when you go and you read it, you'll see that they say, hey, if you need an industrial water source, go to a municipality and they'll give it to you, or go buy a type 1, or go buy a type 2. Or in the eventuality, in that uncertain case where there's nowhere for you to get water that is economic, right? The only sources available to you are just prohibitively expensive. Then in those cases, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll stand right here. That way, Ed, you can hear me. So then in those cases, when you can't find a right that is economically viable for you, you can go to the department. You can say to the department, hey, look, I tried to get a source of water. Couldn't find a type 1, couldn't find a type 2. What am I supposed to do? I'd like a general industrial use permit. And the law says those are available for us to give as long as it's consistent with the management plan. Here in Willcox, we're saying they are not consistent with the management plan unless you offset it. I want to be clear. When I say offset, I'm not saying transfer. I'm not saying you go buy an IGFR's water. That's not quite what's happening. Although it feels that way, because what we're saying is, sure, we'll give you that permit. You've got it now, says you can pump, but you also have to go find someone else in the basin, a farmer, a willing farmer in the basin, and he turns off his water. He says, okay, if you're going to be pumping more, then I'm going to be pumping less. The department does not sit there and micromanage the relationship between the two, but I'm guessing there's money involved, right? That's what happens, right? It's not a transfer. So Ed's asking about type 1s. it is true that an irrigation grandfathered right holder can convert that IGFR to a type 1 industrial permit. And there are limitations on how much water converts over. But I think there was confusion when we talked about what happens with that water when someone has to offset. That's correct. Mark says that's a permanent conversion when you change from an IGFR to a type 1. And he's right. Once it becomes a type 1, that's an industrial water use that's tied to the land, the end, right? Whereas with these GIUs, all we say is there has to be some sort of agreement that water's turning off somewhere else in the basin when new water is turning on under that GIU. So that's what we've been talking about. And then Caleb's point, as I understand it, was, okay, if I, industrial user, need 100 acre feet, maybe I don't need to go find a farmer with 100 acre feet to turn off, but there needs to be some sort of cut. So I get 100 acre feet and he turns off 100 plus X, whatever that may be. So I hope that clarifies where we are and how we got here. All right.
Ed, does that clarify?
I hope we wouldn't call it a way to get around a type 2. Type 2, of course, for everyone to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, is an industrial right that is not tied to land. It's tied to the right holder. So you can go anywhere in the AMA to use it. Type 1 is tied to the land. And so Ed's asking, hey, does that mean that an irrigation grandfathered right holder could use their water to benefit industrial use anywhere in the basin? To a certain degree, yes. However, remember, you can only get a GIU if you can show the department, I tried to get a type 1, there wasn't one available. I tried to get a type 2, there wasn't one available at an economic price. And that doesn't mean more than I wanted to pay, but you have to show that it is not economically viable. Okay, so there are limitations there.
So because there would be type 1 available if they went to the same farmer that they were going to pay to not farm and not use this water, then technically the department could say, well, you got to use type 1 from him and transfer that to 2 acre feet. The idea is this thing is a bit, there's some question about how much database stuff will come. How radical will it be? Our goal as a group of farmers when we designed this 50% cut was to make sure that we stay within that range. So I think the director, no matter who it was, right now it's Tom, and we feel certain Tom would vote in our favor, but no matter who the director was down the way, as long as it's clear what our basin management goal is, which that slide that's up there right now shows, then we should be safe. Is that correct?
There was a few things you said. So first you said, wouldn't it be the case that the farmer that you have an agreement to not use water would have a type 1? I don't know that that would be the case because Mark makes the point that it's a permanent change, and that's right. To have a type 1, that means you no longer have an irrigation right. You have permanently changed the nature of your right. So there's that consideration, right? Whether or not you can find someone who's willing to do that. To your second point about consistency with the management goal, whether that's the only thing you would need to worry about.
GUI is still subject to plan.
That's correct.
Removing those acre feet from the subject of this of the plan anyway.
The GIU, the IGFR, any type 2, all rights are going to be subject to the management plan. And I will note, because I'm sensing some question about whether the GIU permits are perhaps wise or whatever, they are statutory. So the department is not a legislative body. We enforce the law as written. We include the GIUs because they're included in the statute.
So let me question now. So 10,000 acre feet. He's quite a large farmer. He's got 10,000 acre feet. He takes the 5% cut. He puts all his farms together. Database company come and says, hey, we need all your 10,000 acre feet in a type 1, and we'll bill on your land. So if they consolidate that with that 5% cut, now it's all one. Can that database company go build on a given site on that farm and use all 10,000 acre feet? Or is it have to be spread out over the whole thing and there's some protection against that because of that?
That's a very particular question. I think that I think what I'm hearing your concern about is that a large acreage would then have, would then have a very large water user on a very small amount of land. I think we would want to take a look at the details of this hypothetical. I don't feel like I'm ready to give you an exact answer to that one.
Okay. Secondly, flex credits. So, yeah, and we do need to study that one out, man, because I promise you it's coming. If this thing goes as wild as I think it's going to. Secondly, so flex credits. So a given farmer owns 5 different farms. Can he take flex? Let's say one farm has more water than he needs and one farm has less. Can he use his own flex credits from one farm to the other without consolidation?
So we're not talking about transferring between different farmers. We're talking about one farmer transferring between IGFRs is what you're asking.
Let's just use myself, for example. If one of my farms doesn't have enough water rights,
Yeah, those would be separate flex accounts. So unless they are regulated under the integrated farm program, they would be subject to the regular prohibitions against transfers between flex accounts.
so I couldn't
So
move
that's right.
one farm flex credits to part of the farm that needs it.
I'm sorry, would you say that one more time? I had someone else saying something.
I couldn't move. So let's say as part of my farm, and as you know, because of that cactus, some of my farm's going to be pretty short. Other parts of the farm might have a little extra, but it's a different farm number. It's not all put together. And I take the flex credits from the part of the farm that has too much and use it on the other part of the farm. It's a different account. Can I move? In other words, as one owner, can I use the flex credits on the other farm?
The answer, Ed, is yes. There are ways to transfer flex accounts, or excuse me, flex credits between different flex accounts, but there's timing limitations. Dan's sitting here in the room and pointed it out. Every 2 years, or there's a 2-year limitation before you would be able to transfer those. I think we've talked about those before.
Yeah, we did. So for clarification, if Dan's so
Sorry.
if we move, okay, we wait 2 years and we buy the flex credits to the other farm number. So that other farm number that was using that flex credit, does it use it from then on? Does that have to happen every year after?
A flex credit is an amount that was conserved in a particular year and then can be used later, but it's not a perpetual addition to your allotment.
So it would have to be technically you would get a cycle where next year you do flex credits and next year
Potentially.
you can keep it going, but it would constantly be flex credits from the farm that has some to have flex credits to the other farm that doesn't have them, correct?
Potentially that could be done.
Ed, what about integrating the farm units?
That's certainly a possibility, but that question came to me actually from another. I just use myself as an example. It was a wise question, and part there. Most growers, I get the idea, are not too upset about giving the 5% to join everything together because then it's so flexible, and that's probably right. But there might be those odd situations that it would need to be the other way, and that's why I asked that.
Understood.
Shoot.
So when the agriculture group met and they talked, one of the things that they talked about is that the larger water users wouldn't make the smaller agriculture users, the small farms, because there's not very many of them, and the vineyards make the same cuts across the board, that they would be willing to eat more of those cuts. And so based on what I understand now, it's just across the board. And so that would be all the wineries that are already pretty efficient with the crops they're growing in and the water they're using. And I just wanted to just get the group's opinion on that. Is there a reason we went away from that, or is it a requirement by state law that it just has to be equitable? Everyone has to do the same.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Hunched over two phones. Yeah. So Caleb, your question being, why is it that there is not differentiation? As we worked through this, we really appreciate the buy-in that we've had from folks here. Of course, at the end of the day, this is a regulatory document where we have to follow the requirements that we have. So it's not really a deal struck, right? And as we've worked through this, we feel like we need to make sure that there is sufficient water for all the crops historically grown. By applying that standardized 10% cut with those few exceptions where it does not give sufficient, we see, comparing to the best available data, that we can still provide that. So that's what we've done. But we have received comment that there should be a threshold under which we don't drop. But as of right now, this is the draft.
Recommendation to look into that further.
The GUAC is empowered to make their comments to the director.
Something. It's a comment. How about this, Caleb? Speaking of, let's let this thing go. We'll always have chance to address this maybe in the future. I think we're trying to, and Ed, I think this is just me talking, but I think we gotta be careful we don't kill something because of so many exceptions. Maybe. I think that's my take. The simpler we can keep this, I think the better at this point.
Disagree at all. I totally agree, but it's questions I've been asked, and I promise we're gonna be hit at every angle. I actually agree with you, Ted, but those are questions. I got a list of questions for today, and that was part of them.
Right. And Caleb, if I understand it, at this point, this chair, this board will entertain motions on changes you would like to see, and I'm here to help facilitate that.
So, and this is a question for staff is, so we'll have public comment, and this was an opportunity for the board to just share some of our thoughts. And then it will come back to the board again after public comment at the end of September, and we'll have another look at everything, and you guys will have another look at all the public comments and massage from there. Is that kind of or is this our one last opportunity to share those things?
So it's not your last opportunity. Right now, we're getting comments from the council as a body. We're also taking informal comments from anyone else who wants to make those comments through September 3rd. Then we're spending a month updating the plan to the extent it needs to be we find it needs to be updated. Then we're going to make it available. Then we're going to enter a public, or I apologize, a formal comment period. We're going to have a hearing. There's going to be an opportunity for everyone to submit those formal comments ahead of the hearing and at the hearing itself. So this is the one opportunity for the council to make comments as the council. So this is these comments, right? Your feedback to the director and the department today in this public meeting is what's going to be presented at the formal hearing. This is what's going to be entering, a summary of this is what's going to be entering into that formal record. But like all other individuals, you'll still have the opportunity to provide those formal comments during the formal comment period.
So point of clarification.
Comments, my individual comments, they don't speak because we're not speaking as a board. So I would have to bring a motion forward of something specific saying like, hey, I would like you guys to look at requiring some kind of cuts for industrial users, such as data centers in the future, if they were to, for when water rights were transferred, if they were to obtain water rights.
That's right.
What's the term that they would set aside so much of it back and that they would help reach safe yield sooner?
Right, I get what you're saying. And we have talked about that. Ed, did you hear that? So Ed, Caleb had been asking and brought up if an agriculture IGFR is, and I know it's not a transfer, I don't want to, but if somehow that water gets used for an industrial use, instead of 100% of the water that's going from the agricultural IGFR to the industrial use, Caleb's saying, well, how about we say a cut of it goes away? So instead of 100, say 90 gets used to help reach our long-term goal of cutting our overdraft by 50% quicker. You remember talking about that, don't you?
Absolutely.
But
that we need to keep our goal in mind because that's what's going to stabilize our basin. And I'm not against AI centers. I am, or database. I am against high water use. And obviously at this point, there's nothing in the state. There's no laws that prevent that, whatever. At the same time, for us in agriculture, our main goal is to stabilize Willcox Basin. And our plan will do it. I think if you look at the ADWR wells, in some places that they quit double cropping so much that things stabilized already in certain areas. So
okay.
So I guess I want to stay as long as we cut. I'm with Caleb.
Okay, I want to keep this specific, so you're on board. Doug, do you have a thought on that? If it's going from agriculture to industrial, have like, do you have a number in your head, Caleb?
100 DIU, let's be specific.
10%?
I would like to, I would think at least, and I would like to talk with like APCO and Arizona G&T. I know they're the same, and some of these other groups, but obviously for a city, we love industrial use. It brings in a lot more revenue than agriculture brings in, and through property taxes and other things. But if we can't conserve our water, citizens are never going to support anything like that anyways. And so if there's a way to appease both sides where agriculture makes money, and that's what I'm just going to be blunt. They'll make money by transferring those water rights or selling them or whatever you're doing. And then that industrial user now has them, but we're reaching safe yield faster by passing those water rights on. As far as I'm concerned, everyone wins, and it's the city wins, the hospital wins, the
Okay, let's keep it down. Okay, you're on. What about 10%? Because that's what I remember when in these different meetings. Or does that,
I think that sounds great.
Doug, what do you think on this, on the GIUs?
Same.
They are all regulated under the management plan. I see. No, they are not they are not.
You don't want to allow the transfer. Did you hear that, Caleb? Because see, the ag guys are we're getting cut initially and ongoing, and they're not.
The industrial users aren't.
Right.
Wait a minute, because there's a difference here. It's the beast, when we're talking about GIUs right now, that's the terminology. That's when a farmer leases, he's not transferring a water.
Because
right.
it's 10-year
He's
max.
leasing his current water his GFR. IGFR to an industrial use. It's not a permanent transfer. So that transfer is going to be subject to the reductions because it's still ag water. It remains ag water. So that water is subject to the reductions. If you transfer IGFR as a type 1 or type 2, now it's outside of that. So these ones, I think are advantageous to the goal. If a farmer leases through the GIU to an industrial use, it remains subject to the cuts.
And it has a 10-year life. Is that correct?
It has only a 10-year life.
It has.
So these are favorable, if you ask me, compared to a type 1 or type 2 transfer, which is a permanent. It moves it out of the requirements of agricultural improvement and reduction. Oh yeah, they got to give a plan and say, well, this is what we're going to do, but there's no teeth in it.
I'll note that it is a 10-year permit, but it is subject to renewal by the law, but it would have to be renewed.
But Doug, in the fact that once it goes industrial, and if they don't have to take the cuts, it's got to meet.
Yeah.
Yes, Ed, this is Mark. Listen, okay, you're right. I think we all agree with that. So the way to do it then is if you want to move water to industrial and you want it to be subject to the plan, that would be through the GIU. It's not a permanent transfer. It's you saying, hey, I could sell 100 acre feet for the next 10 years. You're leasing it though. You're not transferring it under the GIU. It's a 10-year agreement that has to be renewed after 10 years. And during that 10-year period, if the plan says, hey, you got to reduce another 5%, well, that transfer is subject to that same 5%. Okay. So there's that.
What I would say is Mark's point being that the cuts in the agricultural water that is being turned off to enable the industrial water have the embedded cuts. So therefore the industrial user to a degree has that embedded cut as well. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah.
there's a couple of ways to
I'm
transfer your.
I'm on board.
There's a couple of ways to transfer your water. Okay. There's a permanent way, which is when you do to a type 1 or type 2. That's a permanent transfer. Once you do that, that water is considered industrial from now to eternity, and it is not subject to any further cuts. Okay. Now, in this plan, it offers an additional way to do that where it's not permanent. You're leasing your water to an industrial use. It's through an agreement. It's a private agreement between you and the industrial user. It's negotiated between you, the farmer, and the industrial user. It can only be a 10-year period. Okay. But that water is subject to all the existing controls under the management plan and the goals of the plan. Okay. So really it leaves you up to the farmers to decide How do you want to do it? Do you want to do it temporarily through a 10-year agreement, having it subject to these cuts? The thing that we've put on the table here, though, is we'd like to maybe see, even under that situation, a 10%
Addition.
cut from that. So if you lease 100 acre feet, okay,
The guy getting.
the guy only gets 90 of it. Okay. But that, again, this is temporary. This is an IGU. It's only a 10-year term, and then it has to be renewed. Okay. It's not permanent. And so if you do it that way for five periods, every period that there comes out a new management plan, a new 10-year management plan, that lease and that water would be subject to the new terms of that management plan. So there is a way for farming to make sure that that industrial water is in fact subject to the plan, and it's through this IGU. That's outside of the permanent ways to do it. When you actually, let's say that an industrial user buys 1,000 acres and then on their own volition, because they own the land, transfer that permanently to a type 1 or type 2, then that moves that water outside of
The ag cut.
the ag cuts.
Yeah. Does that, okay, so without this, we don't want to be here till midnight. I don't anyway. Does that make sense to you 5 people, us 5 people? Does that make sense, Doug? Would you be? Okay, that's okay. Do you, Ed, understand, and would you support that? Doug's gonna abstain because he's not sure. It's a lot, Doug,
I tend to agree with Doug. Let's soak on this a little bit. Right off the bat, a 10% cut. Yeah, that was designed, and some other things we originally looked at was every time it was transferred, there was a cut, and they called it the haircut.
So would the board take a comment that ADWR take a comment that the board would like to recommend that under the IGU, there be a required 10% cut in that lease of IGFRs? Okay, so that's a formal comment now from the board, which they
Well-
will consider.
okay, but wait a minute.
That's on the IGU one.
Doug's not sure about it.
Well, it's a comment from me, because I think that's what they're saying, 10%. Does everybody agree on that? It does go through at 10%. You asked for that.
I just want to make sure that the board, if it's from the board, we don't have to be unanimous, but I do want to make sure that everyone understands. And I think Doug and Ed, I heard from Ed that he kind of would like to not swallow it yet. Caleb, you would like to see this 10% on as we're language. There's too many GIU. So I'm with you, Caleb. I think Mark is, but I think Ed and Doug would like to kind of hold off. If we want this from the board, we can do it with 3. Is that right?
And Ted, again, if I can just share my comments with Ed and Doug, I feel like it still puts the ball in agriculture's court. They never have to get rid of their water. They can do what they want with their water still. I look at it more as a larger community, right? Obviously, the county wants some of those taxes, the city wants those taxes, and the revenue it brings in. But it like zoning and data center coming and going through the process of doing something like that in the future will not get passed if there's nothing that they have to give, if there's no cuts. The only way it's going to work and the only way farmers will actually make money from that deal, because the community will come up in an uproar. And so it at least gives farmers and it gives communities the opportunity to say there's a positive to this coming in. We reach a safer yield sooner than later. Like that's my big point.
I think what Doug brought up, Caleb, and he's what I'm not positive either is if the farmer gives up the water, and say it does take that 10% cut, but if the farmer would have kept it, and he maybe would have had to give up 20% over the period of that management plan, but now and that would have happened, but now only 10% is being given up.
That's not true. That's not accurate because under the IGU transfers, it's a temporary transfer that are subject to all the existing underlying agricultural cuts.
Okay.
So.
And you're comfortable with that, Ben, that
It's-
statement?
It sounds, excuse me, it sounds like what Mark is saying is the amount that would have to be offset would be the water allotment. That water allotment is subject to the management plan, and any, for example, these cuts right here have been embedded in the water
Right.
duties. So yes, what I'm hearing Mark describe is consistent with how I'm thinking about it as we're working through this right now. I'd also note, of course,
Does that
that
make sense?
industrial users also have other requirements that they would also have to meet
It's okay.
in addition.
Okay, so Doug wants to think on it, and that's fine. One thing we want to do here, in my opinion, us 5 people on this board and hopefully the whole community, is we want to be able to visit and follow our conscience and not have any kind of repercussions or whatever. And I'm feeling that. I'm not feeling that. I'm feeling that we're all in good spirits and united, and I want to keep that. So no pressure, Doug. Ed, do you want to think about this, or would you like to help? Would you want to be on this, a part of this as a comment from this advisory board? It'd be 4 of us doing it, or are you more comfortable just to like Ed or Mark and Caleb could put these in as individual comments too? We don't have to do this from an advisory board.
What I would say is, I definitely want to see it. You know, let's think about
Well, IGFRs are not on the table, right? That's a law, statute. GIUs. So Ed and Doug, GIUs, it's not whether or not we want GIUs. We're getting GIUs. The only question on the table is, should they come with a cut or not? That's the question on the table. Should they come with a cut? And 3 of us say, yes, 10%. Now we can argue over the number. It can be 0 or it can be any number, but we're getting IGUs in the plan because it's statute. The question on the table is what if we think should there be a cut to it when there's a lease of your water to an industrial use? That's the only question on the table right now.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, I'm going to call for the question because otherwise we'll talk. Caleb, if you're moving, I'm not, are you moving that we put a 10% cut in GIU leases?
Yes,
I second.
that's correct.
Mark seconded it. Is there any other discussion before I call for a vote? Is that a vote or you have a question? What's your question, Ed?
Originally, we talked through many things about how much haircut. Let's don't jump to this 10% till we figure out where that really needs to be.
Yeah, okay.
That's fair.
Can I make one other suggestion, Ted? I just want to throw this out to staff. I would love, this is our first time, not our first time, but where we've really gotten to talk about it, talk about the plan, and we each represent different sectors. It would be amazing to go back and gain opinions from some of the people, check with some attorneys, right? And just say, what are some of these other effects? And maybe even reach out to Arizona G&T and some of these other groups and say, like, what's realistic, and look at some best practices and then come back and talk about it. I mean, is there anything wrong if we had another meeting to discuss some of this stuff more?
I don't see why not. But here's.
That's not quite what we're saying. So I'll come up to the mic so everyone can hear me. So you saw, Taylor, can we go back to the timeline slide? So I mentioned that there's a statutory requirement for the director to promulgate the first management plan within 2 years of the designation. So the designation or the establishment, right, was January 8th, 2025. So that would put it at January 8th, 2027 when we have to promulgate it. So we're very tight, frankly, on time. So there's a formal comment period, right? We're not trying to shut down this discussion. I think it's very productive. I appreciate that there may be others not in the room, not on the council you want to counsel with, but to be able to introduce another public meeting into the process, I'll just be blunt, it's going to put this statutory timeline at some risk, which also will put then the conservation requirements at some risk. And just sharing, my opinion from where I sit as AMA director, that means that starting progress on this goal, starting to be able to enforce some of these requirements across the board, including GIUs, including data centers, including anything else, right, is going to be delayed that much further. So just to offer that as information.
Okay. So I don't know what to say, but you heard what Olga said. I think if the two of us are in doubt, I say let's hold up. If we're not sure,
To do a formal to you guys as a council, as a board.
So in order, you would have to have a public meeting, right? So in order for you to be able to provide those comments to us as a council, other members of the public would have to be able to hear those.
get that.
So can we motion that it's and we're only advisory anyway. So,
But it's not in there now.
it's not. So could we say a minimum? Say that we want to see a minimum?
There, we're starting to get somewhere. Just don't lock ourselves down on something that is just a lot of pressure. I mean, the governor of Texas stopped stuff on this for a while. Words in Doug's mouth, but I think for both of us, this is bigger than us. And we need to dang sure understand what we're agreeing to. And we don't want to put ourselves into a 10% cut when we have a chance. And I think Lisa said, I'm sure Lisa is for whatever we can do that is the most advantageous for the long-term debate.
Okay,
I agree.
The way I hear Mark, and I think the way I hear it, these leases are going to be allowed as the proposed plan stands with a 1-to-1 transfer
By statute.
by statute. If
No,
we,
not the 1-to-1 is not by statute.
not by
but the lease
statute,
is.
but the leases.
Not the leases, that the department has to, yes. Not that every application for a GIU is going to be approved, but that GIUs exist as a construct is statutory.
GIUs existing as a construct. How exactly they exist is up for interpretation.
But an initial,
GIUs are going to be part of the plan, no matter what.
and it's right now, it's a 1-to-1 transfer.
That's correct.
So that's done. Well,
It's not done.
It's not done, but that's what's proposed.
That's what we're discussing.
Olga keeps. So Ed, if we say we're not gonna talk, we're not gonna do anything right now, that's fine. But then they'll be there and it'll be a 1-to-1. Do we want to even ask as a council, do we want to ask staff to look into some type of a cut on these leases, or do we want to just leave this alone? That,
Council to look into. That's my opinion.
so here's what I think, council. There's 2 of our members that would really like to look into this. I think we should be prudent and look into it.
So
I don't want the first vote we ever do to be 3-2. That's not my kind of world.
So I'm going to retract my second then, and Caleb, and I'm going to.
Can you hold off on that, Caleb?
I'm fine with changing
Okay.
that.
Can I,
Just-
can I motion that we request that the ADWR look into the opportunities for a cut to the basic water lease under the GIU, that we apply some level of cut to that? What would make the most sense economically and to meet the goals of the,
And
of
if,
the plan?
and if
I'm
we need a,
motioning that.
and if we need a public meeting, can't we do one virtually and everybody can join like we did our first meeting?
We can do them virtually, yes.
Be easier, that would be more, that would be easier to fit into the timeline.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, how about this then, Ed and Doug and everybody? Mark moved that we ask staff to look into what this would look like and the ramifications and get back with us. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, so there's a motion on the floor, so we need a second, or
I'll second it.
Caleb seconded. I understand that we're asking staff to look into what this type of business would look like. I'm sorry.
Reductions.
These not
Sure,
transfers,
GIUs,
these leases. Is that okay with you, Doug? Are you okay with that, Ed?
Yes, yes.
we have a second, so
We have a second and we have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Start with you, Caleb.
Aye.
Aye. Ed?
Aye.
Mark, aye. Doug's aye. Our first vote was unanimous. That's more my style.
And nice job, Ted.
Okay, listen, are you okay, Caleb, as far as anything else that was on your mind? I'd like to.
I'm fine with issuing, I shared issue separately. And then maybe if there's any comments between now and our next meeting, if the staff would share some of those comments and give us a highlight of them from different community members. And we could at least see some of those. I think that'd be great.
Okay. Ed, did you have any other burning things that we really need to get to today?
This is fine. I'm glad we're talking.
Okay, Doug, did you have anything else before? Mark, did you have anything else? The only one I had, if I can bring this up, and I might just, Caleb, I'm gonna, well, all right. Ever since I've been meeting with the ag deals, we've been talking about silage corn on there. And really grain corn is the largest corn crop. And then somehow sweet corn got on there. Grain corn, can we get a number on that eventually for the consumptive use?
Yes, so that's noted as an omission. We'll make that update and add it.
Okay. And then the last thing I had. Oh,
Silverton's willing to work with us on that green corn and give a scientific explanation of that need.
okay. Okay. The other thing I had, from what I understand, Olga, the stone fruit deal, where they're not going to have the 10% cut, was because of economic viability.
No, so to clarify, those were the apples, cherries, pears without ground cover, and the stone fruit without ground cover. Those were not cut, not because of the results of the economic viability study. Those were not cut because the consumptive use estimates that the department determined we determined that compared to the USGS data, compared to other remote sensing observations of consumptive use, cutting them 10% will put them below what those crops actually need to be able to be grown. So those were not cut, right? Our goal here, we have to provide sufficient water to continue irrigating these crops. And we determined that if we were to take a 10% cut from those two categories, they would not, meet that requirement.
Okay, that helps. That helps me. I guess what I wanted to state, and this is from me, but I think from the farmers that I've talked to, this initial 10% is something they can live with. But they're worried about future and getting to the point where, well, we can't make it anymore and we're going to go out of business. So does ADWR, does the law is that considered? Is that issue considered?
As a general rule, the law is always considered. Your question is not about this management plan, but subsequent.
Subsequent.
And what I don't want to do is get too bogged down in the future, you know, as unknowable as it is, right? We will be required to go through a formal process like this before we make any changes. So we do feel like looking down the road to meeting our management goal, a lot more than just what we've done here is going to be required. What that looks like, I can honestly say, we don't know. We do not have a plan that we're just not rolling out yet, right? We feel like first, what we want to do is implement these. We're going to have much better data available to us to see truly what the overdraft looks like, especially with this gravity data that's going to be coming in with all the reporting requirements that are going to be triggered once we issue all of these rights. So we're going to go understanding much more into the future. Where we go from there, we're going to have to figure that one out together. But the law will be considered. The importance of rights issued by the department and protected by law will continue to exist. We can't just take rights away, right? So that's going to be a conversation that's going to be ongoing.
Gotcha. Okay, with that, I think we're caught up, and I'd like to keep moving. Do we want to call to the public? I think. Okay. All right. Let's open it up to a call to the public. I think we should do that. So I've got a mic. I can go around to anyone that would like to have a comment. Please state your name.
Okay, my name is Barbara Pierce. I'm with my husband, Dan. We have submitted a letter to the GUAC committee, and Callie has delivered it. It is back to our request that since vineyards are do not take any extra water out of the aquifer, basically, whatever goes to recharge, we're asking that we be exempt or be excused from the reduction. We should not, in our opinions, be punished for excess water use when we do not use it. And we do bring a strong economic driver to this area, to the state of Arizona. So I want you to, as a committee, to really comment, really be thoughtful about not punishing us for that piece. We are conservative. We want to support this, the water conservation, but we should not also be punished because we do not use extra water.
So we've got a request, and now did Ed hang up? You know, it would have helped a lot if those two guys were here, but yeah.
So you took as a comment earlier, my comment on this very thing, that can we consider, so I think it's already been said, can we consider the, not just look at it as a 10% cut, but say the closer a user gets to what is a natural recharge, maybe do a graduated, if we can look at, you know, if you're using, 2 times the natural recharge, yeah, 10%. If you're using 1.5%, 8% cut. If you're using the natural recharge, maybe it's no cut, something like that, instead of just a flat 10%. That was my comment earlier. So that's already been noted, right? Okay. Is that? You're welcome.
Sonia Gasho. couple questions, comments. One is, I believe you said that there's two choices in the I use microphones often. They put those buttons in terrible places. So I believe you said under the agricultural chapter, there's two conservation choices and it is not best management practices. I would like to say why, because having best management practices would allow an awful lot of flexibility for agriculture to adapt new technologies as they come along and be better able to reach those goals than simply the ADWR only having two conservation choices. I also saw nothing in there about recharge wells or any of those kinds of things being part of this plan. And yeah, that's a concern because there's lots of things we can be doing and I saw nothing of any of those in there. And you're saying agriculture gets mandatory cuts and nobody else does. Again, that's a problem. So I like the suggestion to be looking into, you know, with your transferring or leasing, whatever the term you want to use, that there is another cut for the industrial user, basically, because they're not seeing one as at the top. So, and I also would say the federal government does it all the time. Yes, you have a timeline. Yes, it's in statute. Totally understand and respect that. But your advisory board is advising you that they need more time to be able to give you good advice. Don't tell them we don't got enough time to listen to you.
Thank you. Anyone else? State your name, please.
I'm Rona McMillan, vineyard owner. I'll try and keep it to one question. I've got a very general question, which is, we have this goal for 2075 of the 50% reduction, but I don't see any goals in this management plan for how we'll know we've achieved part of the goal by whatever the 10 years is on. So I would have expected to see some metrics in there, and we may not have the metrics right now, but definitions of what success will look like in 10 years' time. So I'd like to see that, if that is possible to include in the plan. The other thing I don't quite understand is why 2029 is the date.
States are on.
What, the 2 years? But we were already 2 years beyond, and like it was 2025 was the date. And then we had to adopt the plan. And then there's another 2 years until we do any conservation targets. So I'm not quite sure why it's 2029.
They can't.
It's statutory, right? So it's that 2 year timeline. That's something in statute that we have to abide by.
So did you have some? You sure? Okay.
Jackie Watkins, in the hydrology section, can you add a section that of what the recharge is? Because, you know, recharge is less than 5%. So if there's a 12-inch, you know, if the valley gets 12 inches of rain, about a half inch is the only amount that's actually being recharged into the groundwater. So if you can add that just so that people can be aware of what the minute area, you have the 54,000 acre feet in there, but if you could also just say what that is.
I'll just respond to that really quickly because it's a clarifying point. So in the hydrology chapter, we talk more about kind of the structure, but in the supply and demand chapter, that's where we go through all of the inflows, including the recharge, and provide, you know, those estimates over time.
So my name is Cheryl Knott, and I just, because data centers came up a couple of times from a couple of different people, and I really appreciated that, what I heard there. I just wanted to let you all know, if you don't already know, that Cochise County just a couple of months ago passed a new ordinance for data centers, and it does allow a data center that can't find enough effluent or wastewater, which would be all data centers, to use non-potable, to use groundwater. So I think the discussion about the GIU was a really important discussion, but I think the timing is also really important, because right now we know that the supervisor who represents this area is working really hard to bring a data center here. And the way I read the plan, maybe I've misinterpreted something, but it sounds like if a data center can get going in 27 or 28, they can use as much groundwater as they want. And then at some point after January 1st, 2029, they have, 180 days to come up with a conservation plan. It's so it's a timing issue, but it's also a coordination issue. So I think if you're not already working with the county to sort of harmonize your requirements with the data center ordinance, then maybe it's just something to think about. Thank you.
I'd like to respond and clarify something briefly. So there are the data center requirements. That's that water use effectiveness metric, right? That 0.15. And then there's the conservation plan, like you noted. So a data center would not be considered a new large industrial user. And so it wouldn't be subject to those offset requirements, as you correctly pointed out, if it came before January 1st, 2029. But it's not quite precise to say that they would not have any regulations or any requirements, right? They would have those two requirements under the data center section, that water use effectiveness, that efficiency standard, the conservation report, and then all of the other umbrella industrial requirements. But the requirements for new large industrial users stack. So a new large industrial user that is a data center would be subject to the new large industrial user requirements, individual user requirements if they came via a municipal provider, and the data center requirements, that water usage effectiveness, conservation report, and the umbrella industrial program requirements. So I just want to clarify for everyone, because I think this is a topic that, we've been spending some time on. Which restriction? The new large industrial users, the kind of the cutoff date is 2029, January 1st, 2029.
Today, because the AMA exists and they're going to use groundwater, even though the county says they can use groundwater, is it correct that the user will have to get a water withdrawal authority, either a grandfathered right or a permit, which means if they apply for a permit, they will only get the amount of water that the department determines they are eligible to get because they satisfy those criteria. Or if they get a grandfathered right, it'll be the amount of the type 2 they buy or the amount they can get from a type 1, right? No,
That's incorrect. What Dan said is right. After 2029, then additional requirements are for new industrial users start to stack on top.
Steve. Thank you. Sorry, we're here so late. I'll try not to keep you too much longer. Yeah, exactly. I've got just loads of thanks for all you guys have done. I know, Olga, that was quite a presentation, and I think we're all grateful and impressed by the work you did in this first management plan. So I think that needs to be said. I really also appreciate your efforts to get better data through the microgravity surveys. I think that's going to be exciting. I had a quick question on that. That covers the entire basin? And is this thing like move around the basin to check gravity, or I'm just curious? My engineering mind wants to know how.
It's like a survey, right? So there are markers, there are stations throughout the basin, and the group collects observations throughout them and then interpolates to capture a total estimate of
So we'll
change
see
in storage.
differential water happening, like say in Kansas settlement, in different parts of Kansas settlement, in different parts of San Arizona.
That's right.
Willcox.
That's right.
So-
The outputs look like a map.
Okay, good. I am totally supportive of these new limitations on industrial. Just a little disappointed it doesn't go into effect till 2029, given some of the things that are happening. But as we heard, there will still be constraint. We're in a better position now with the AMA in place than we were just a little less than 2 years ago. Here's a couple of comments as far as changes or additions to the. I'm kind of concerned about the whole calendar, the schedule. I know you showed the schedule for getting to the management plan, but I think someone else, it might have been Doug, alluded. It's not real clear in the management plan how this whole thing moves forward because, you know, the AMA started in 2025, January 25. This plan technically doesn't go into effect till 2029. It's a 10-year plan. Does that take us out to 2039? Or do we start a new plan in 2035? How many years of this 10% are we going to actually see? Or how many years is going to go by before we would get the next plan, which conceivably would be more than 10%? It has to be more than 10% because we've got a 50% goal to get to with the, I don't know, 10% of. Anyway, that's something, I'm not asking you to answer that today. I'm just saying I think it would be good to put that in. And I also think it would be good to give that long range plan of how each plan plays out in terms of the time frame all the way out to 2075. I venture to say most of us won't be here then, but I think it's really important. I know personally, I mean, we've fought for this thing for years because we wanted to see some assurance that there would be a water future for this basin that would go well beyond 2075. And the reality is most of us domestic well users are still going to see our wells go dry before this plan reaches that 50% and maybe even before the end of the first management plan. So it'd be good for us to see what we can expect in terms of how that will improve down the road. And I know you can't tell what will happen in the next management plans because each of those will be discussed. But I think it's good to at least paint some picture for the public as they read this plan for all of us to get some assurances of where this thing is headed. And to that word too, I know this isn't part of the AMA, but I think it might have been Ted, or maybe it was Doug, is, you know, for us to get to this 50% for ag, it's going to be a huge stretch, and it's going to get tougher and tougher. And we can't really do that with the resources that are available within the AMA, the plan. So is there a way that the management plan could at least suggest that there be some kind of some kind of group that could augment the AMA or come up with a plan for how economically we can help the farmers? We can incentivize things in ways that are outside the AMA because, you know, I know you want to leave this flexibility. Each farmer does their own thing, but I guarantee you there's just no way. There's just no way they're going to be able to deal with this when we're talking about, getting to the 50%. And 50% doesn't satisfy most of us, you know. If we're going to safe yield, it'd be impossible. So, you know, getting to that, we need to acknowledge that, and whether that can be in the management plan or not, I don't know. But somehow, as a community, as a state, as a county, as a state, we need to acknowledge that and work towards that with our legislature or wherever we have to. So, if we can get some guidance or some direction on that from you guys, that would be helpful. The next thing I wanted to mention is in a number of the hydrology reports, it's mentioned the two large cones of depression in the Kansas settlement and the San Jose area, and that those were coalescing. And I read that in a 2018 report. I'm sure by now, since a lot of new irrigation has gone on in those two areas since then, that's changed a lot. I've always made the case, I think I made the case when we did the goal, that there be a differential goal depending on what part of the basin, because I mean, if you live in the Kansas settlement area or you live in the San Jose area, your well, some of your wells are dropping 10 feet a year right now. So if we're thinking about keeping that area sustainable, we may need to look at a management plan that provides some differentiation of for the reductions in that area. And it just so happens that our largest irrigator happens to operate in those two areas. You know, Riverview has the two areas, and that's pretty much where that that cone of depression probably existed before they were under full operation. But bottom line is, we need to work with them to save the domestic wells in that area. The last thing I'll mention is the IGFR applications, and I appreciate you putting at least the summary in the document in the management plan about the 415 IGRF applications. But then I read the next phrase in that 106 include SCI. Is there any way you can quantify well, I guess there's 2 points. Is there any way you can quantify the impact of those SCIs? Because my sense is, we could be, even with the 10% cut in source management plan, we could still be behind where we are right now today by 2039 if all those SCIs become fully operational. And so the other part of this question has to do with, are you going to look at the SCIs in a more, or can you even, from a statute standpoint, in a more critical way, or a more, well, in a way that takes into account where we're at with this basin in terms of the overdraft? And I don't know legally if there's a legality issue there, but I really think, this is good. This is going to help a lot of people that are, the goal is just going to get tougher the more we grow in the next 2 years, 3 years with this FCI. And I understand why that's in there, but if we can mitigate that to some extent, that would be helpful. So that's it. Thank you. Again, thanks for all your work on this.
Thank you. Thank you. If there's any other comments, if they're short, that'd be great, but we're open to any. We had a call to the public. Hearing none. Anything from you, Olga? You guys have anything? It's been moved that we adjourn. You second it, Doug? It's second and moved, and I concur. This meeting's adjourned. Thank you.